Hello and welcome back. Just like that, spring's here in the Northern Hemisphere. How did that happen? But here in Colorado, we skipped winter and are experiencing a record drought. But diehard boaters are already plotting their out-of-state trips and lowering their standards. I hope everyone is ready to go for the season and ready to lower their standards. Today, as part of the Tales from the Crips new DEI initiative, we're going to include an underrepresented user group, the packrafter. If you're a packrafter, packraft curious, or just like to hear some good adventure stories, then it's time to turn on, tune in, drop out, and listen to another episode of Tales from the Crips. Oh, did you think we were about to start the episode? What? You don't care about the sponsors that help make this possible? If you need to still stock up on gear for the paddling season, look no further than Four Corners Riversports to find all the latest and greatest kayaking, rafting, and Riversports gear. Four Corners Riversports is located in Durango, Colorado. They're a full-service paddle sports retail and rental store. If you're looking to get on the water, look no further than Four Corners Riversports. Call them at 970-259-3893 or visit their website at www.riversports.com. This episode is also sponsored by Taylor Barker with the group real estate Steamboat. Known and paddled with Taylor for years, and he brings passion to everything he does. Steamboat Springs is a wonderful town with the Yampa River running right through it and has a vibrant and friendly boating community. If you're thinking of making a move to the Steamboat area or purchasing a vacation home, be sure to get in touch with Taylor. He's happy to give you a lay of the land, the real estate market, and to help find the perfect property for you. You can reach him at 336-314-4353 or by email at taylor@brokerintheboat.com. And you can find those links in the show notes. This podcast is being featured on paddlinglife.com. Paddlinglife.com does a wonderful job of finding all the most interesting happenings in the world of paddling and brings them straight to you in the form of news, interviews, articles, videos, and more. Check out paddlinglife.com. That's it. Now on to the show. Hello and welcome to Tales from the Crips, a whitewater storytelling podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Cripps. So when I first got into kayaking, I began to learn about these things called duckies. It took a minute to realize that ducky was actually a derisive name for what's officially called an IK or inflatable kayak. They were not for serious paddlers. They were for people who couldn't be bothered to do things like learning to roll or practicing edge control. However, at some point, I saw some videos of these other little weird inflatable things that people were taking down creeks called packrafts. They had a proper cover on the cockpit, and they could even sort of be rolled up with some effort. I began to take a little notice, but fortunately, I still had my hard shell, so I could paddle the river properly. But maybe the next time I really took any notice of these things was when I saw some media of people taking packrafts down Vallecito Creek, this classic Class 5 creek near Durango. But not only were they taking it down the classic mile-long gorge section, but they were descending it from many miles upstream through terrain that I knew absolutely nothing about. And so that is where my guest today comes in. He started out as a normal hard shell kayak enthusiast who found a new awakening in the realm of whitewater exploration through these 10-pound boats that you can just carry around on your back and paddle Class 5 whitewater with. So when he approached me with an idea to share some of his adventures of how pack rafting has changed the way he approaches whitewater and exploration, I didn't hesitate to hear more. So that's all the intro I need to give because he will do the rest of the work for me. So welcome to the show, Dan Thurber.
All right. Thanks, Kevin. That's kind of a funny, ironic intro with the comments about the duckies, because the one correction that I would make is that I actually did technically get my start as a paddler in duckies, as we them as like proper inflatable kayak. And that was when I was a teenager. So when I was growing up, my parents were both in the river multi-day scene. My dad was a guide before I was born, and my mom was a logistics coordinator and kind of ran a lot of the business side of the Idaho branch of Grand Canyon Dories. So they were in that real dory centric world of multi-day guiding. And at that time, the Middle Fork of the Salmon wasn't part of the suite of rivers that people were running dories down back in the 70s and 80s. But they were running trips on the Lower Salmon, Hell's Canyon, and Main Salmon. And so when I was an adolescent, that was kind of our like peak uh, family vacation every year. Was just a real casual family float for 4 or 5 days on the Lower Salmon. And
That's
once
cool.
I was in sixth or seventh grade, started getting out of the raft and into a little inflatable kayak that my parents would rent from the college outdoor program for the week. So that was really my first opportunity to be in my own boat and
Hmm.
checking out the river and getting to pick my own lines and getting to have that one-on-one interaction with the river. And I just loved it. It was the
Hmm.
highlight of my year, even though it only lasted for 4 or 5 days. And when I was, 16 or something, on one of the trips I was on, somebody came on the trip paddling an RPM. That was the first time I ever saw somebody in a hard shell whitewater kayak. And I had heard people talk about whitewater kayaks and being able to roll them and some of those things. But that was the first time I saw somebody just playing in the river and having such a blast, surfing waves, and
Hmm.
that we'd get to camp. I mean, I would be in the ducky and kind of chasing him around, but it was clear that I could not do the same sorts of things that he was doing. So I developed my initial obsession with kayaks back then as a mid teenager, and we lived in a college town in La Grande, Oregon, so there was a pool and there were roll sessions happening. So I was able to get into those as a 17-year-old and learned how to roll, but never got to paddle a hardshell kayak on the river. My parents weren't about to let me bring an RPM on a family raft trip, and
Really?
wisely so. Like they didn't want to have to deal with plucking my
Picking
swimming
up the
soggy
courage.
butt out of the water. So I didn't. I learned how to roll, but all of my paddling was limited um, to the inflatables. And then when I went to college in Southern Oregon, in Ashland, Oregon, um, that was when I was super enthusiastic about wanting to learn how to kayak, and I certainly didn't keep that a secret to anybody. I tried to get involved with the outdoor program. I taught skiing at the local ski hill over the winter, and just anybody I met who had anything to do with kayaking, I was telling them about that I was interested, that I was excited, that I could like paddle class 3 in a ducky, and I knew how to roll, and I really wanted to do some hard shelling. Um, so it was thanks to the benevolence of the kind of club boater community down in Ashland. I wasn't paddling with college students. I was paddling with guys in their 30s and 40s, guys and gals, who were kind enough to loan me everything I needed, and and including a ride to and from the river because I was 18, 19 years old, didn't have a car, um, but got into kayaking there and was super eager. One of the As I was talking to people and trying to develop some community and find some mentors to help get me into paddling, one of the things that people kept talking about down there was a handful of folks that were out running really hard stuff and running hard enough stuff that it was worth them taking videos. And there were some feature length paddling films that were coming out of that area around that time. I started paddling I was there in 2003, and that was right after the release of No Big Names 2,
Oh
which
yeah.
from Ashland Mine Productions. And among other people that were part of that team were Eric Seymour and a guy named Ben Stooksbury. Um, and there were as I started to learn more about some of the really high level elite paddlers in that area, I learned some other names. Chris Corbulic was kind of up and coming around that time. I think he might have been a couple of years younger than me, but definitely up on the class 5 scene, and people were talking about his exploits to South America. And then there was also a couple of brothers out of Jacksonville, Oregon, named Dustin and Brandon Knapp, and those were part of Scott Lindgren's crew, of course. And
Mm-hmm.
when and so they had done the second descent of the Middle Kings, and Dustin ran Tenaya Slide, and of course the Sang Po and all of that stuff. So as I was this developing paddler, I was always very acutely aware of some of these local legends that were more than just local legends, have become legends of the global paddling space. And watching some of their videos and hearing about some of their exploits, I kept hearing this term first descent. And that was something that would come up on videos. And I started to formulate this notion that the the real biggest prize in paddling, in terms of downriver paddling, wasn't winning slalom races, wasn't winning rodeos. It was, and it wasn't necessarily running rapids the best or the fastest or winning races or anything like that. It very clearly, in my vision, was first descents as being the premier thing to get excited about and look up to. And but all the while, like, I was struggling to roll up in eddies, struggling to roll up after window shading in a class 2 rapid. So I looked at them and saw the media that they were putting out as this very admirable, cool thing, but it was very clear in my mind that I was never going to achieve things on that same kind of level. But what it did maybe prime me towards a little bit was the notion that you can go and run rivers without having someone on the team who knows that river. And for the most part, most of my paddling in Southern Oregon was on very well documented stuff: the Smith River, the Cal Salmon, other Klamath tributaries, the Trinity. There's a really rich paddling scene down there, and it was pretty easy to find local boaters who knew their way around and would be more than happy to drive me somewhere uh, and pick me up at the dorm room, and we'd go paddle and have a good time. Um, but my brother at the time was my older brother was up in Eugene at University of Oregon, and he had tapped in a little bit closer to a group of higher level paddlers and who were doing their own video production thing, the Epicosity Project folks. And
Oh
so
yeah.
he had a little bit more of a community of high level kayakers that he was paddling with. And he invited me on an overnight trip on the Rogue one year. Came down and did that together. And then he kept talking about this other river, this sister river to the Rogue, called the Illinois. And having grown up in the like multi-day rafting scene, what I knew of as rivers that you could run in a raft were like the rivers that have boat ramps at the put in and take out, and the
Sure.
rivers that have commercial guiding operations with, so the rivers in Dinosaur National Monument and the Grand Canyon, of course, and the Rogue and the Klamath Deschutes, yada yada yada. So when this idea of the Illinois popped up, that was this new, really romantic idea of a mysterious river that I didn't know much about. YouTube wasn't really a thing at the time, so the availability of online beta was pretty scarce. It was limited to blogs, and I think at the time there might have been a write-up on Jason Rackley's OregonKayaking.net page about the Illinois, but other than that, there just wasn't much information. We couldn't get any videos. It had a lot of it was a very notorious river at the time because it wasn't very long before that there had been a big incident where several groups had been out on the river. It rained super hard and spiked from like ideal levels of 2,000 CFS up to 20,000 CFS. Uh,
Wow.
there were fatalities on the river. There were Coast Guard helicopters involved in rescue efforts to get people out of there. And so that event that had happened like 4 years prior was still very fresh in the minds of the paddling community. And within the group of paddlers that I would run with on day trips, most of them were not overnight paddlers. They weren't multi-day boaters. So I I didn't know anybody who had any firsthand experience with this Illinois River. And my by the end of my I guess it was just my sophomore year in college, there was another kid that had shown up who was also an Idaho guide named Will Volpert. And he was a year younger than me, so he was a freshman, but he and I were really connecting and went out and would run a few rivers together. And he got super fired up about this Illinois thing as well. So we just obsessed over this river, poured over it for months, and eventually, after talking to enough people who said that it gave us the sense that it would be a reasonable thing to do, we decided to go ahead and take a shot at it. And so just me and him and his girlfriend at the time went and did a 2-boat trip. We both were rowing small rafts that we borrowed from the outdoor program. And there wasn't much online beta, but there was this very well illustrated guidebook that had aerial photos and all sorts of stuff. So Will's girlfriend Scarlett was our navigator, and the two of us were rowing the boats. And over the course of 2 days, we took this river that was super intimidating to us. It has 10 class 4 rapids and one class 5, and neither of us had ever rowed a boat through a class 5 rapid before. So we just were nervous and intimidated, but we went out there and we did the trip and we got it done and had a spectacular time. And right then, I was still eager about kayaking, but I wasn't very confident because I didn't have my role dialed enough to paddle something as challenging as the Illinois. But I kept at it.
How old were you at that point when you did the Illinois?
I was 19.
19?
And so I had been kayaking for 1 year, but I had been rafting for 4, and was at a point where I was guiding in the summertime in Idaho. And the next year we ended up doing another Illinois trip. I invited my brother that time around, and that time I did kayak. That was in like a December trip. And then the Illinois River just kind of became this local obsession for Will and I, especially through college, and ongoing for him. He still lives in that area and has probably done more trips on that river than anyone alive.
Really?
Running it for 20 years now.
I've never done it, but I've heard it's just a fantastic wilderness river. It should be on more people's radar from what I hear.
Yeah, it's absolutely splendid, and it has kind of a winter runoff season. It has a little bit of a snowmelt season, but it actually has a really long season. And if you can keep an eye on the weather and make sure that you're not going in right before an atmospheric river hits the coast and things go Richter, then it's got a season of runnable flows like 7 to 8 months long, from November to June. However many months that is. So we did a lot of those trips. I think it was the third Illinois trip we did was kind of fun. One of the things, Will and I had access to boats and we had the expertise, but we didn't have a whole lot of money to pay for shuttles, and we also didn't have a car. So we were always trying to find people that wanted to do an Illinois trip that also had a vehicle. And so he started connecting with people up in Portland, cat boaters, and we would find someone that could drive us out there. And he did a marvelous job of getting a lot of people, of putting together a lot of trips, and he'd like plan all the group meals and everything. Anyway, the third trip that we did, I can't remember how many people total were on it, but I was kayaking. Um, at this point, I had done this mysterious remote river 2 times before, and paid a lot of attention to it. Really thought, like, knew all the lines, knew where all the rapids were. Really thought I was kind of hot shit and becoming a bit of an expert and an authority on the Illinois. And so we did this trip where a friend of his, who was also a Middle Fork guide, was passing through the area, and so she came to row a boat and brought her boyfriend and his friend along. And just kind of like, the size of the group kept growing, but it was like, all right, well, these guys all have cars, so the more the merrier. As long as they can help out with the shuttle, let's do this thing. And so Will was going to row a raft and show Tess down, show her the lines, and then I was going to be in a kayak so I could show lines to these other 2 guys. And so one of the guys' names was Ben, and the other guy was Mark. And we're cruising down, and we'd get to like the top of some class 3 rapid with a little move to avoid a minor hole, and I'd give them beta and tell them where to go. And then that was the theme. We'd hop out and scout rapids here and there. I swam at some point, and one of those guys plucked me out and dragged me to shore. We get down to camp that night and start drinking whiskey and hanging out around the campfire, and this guy Ben starts telling some of the stories of some other paddling that he had done earlier that year, and start to put 2 and 2 together, ask him his last name, and this is Ben Stooksbury.
No way. Good thing you had you to advise him, huh?
That was just kind of a funny, real foot in my mouth kind of first introduction to Ben. First time I ever met him. But he sure didn't like present himself super, like, spread a lot of confidence when we were at the put-in, because he had like a cracked playboat and a torn dry suit. But whatever,
Yeah.
that's just what he had. He probably just sold all of his stuff in Colombia 3 weeks before. And
right. When you're scraping together each dime for the next trip, you don't have too much extra money.
So the Illinois was really kind of a formative trip for me. In the first river that I was paddling, where I really got a chance to learn the river and feel this sense of empowerment of like, oh, we can show up to a river that we can, like, there are resources out there other than having someone who knows their way down holding your hand and telling you where to pull over and scout. You can start to like read the river on a broader scale and get a sense of what's coming up downstream, and get an understanding of where you need to pull over and scout. And so another river that I had kind of a similar experience with was in the summertime, the South Fork of the Salmon. In my community of river guides, everybody knew the main salmon and the lower salmon and the middle fork of the salmon, but the South Fork of the Salmon was this tributary that we would float past, and it had all this mystique and was widely regarded as the most challenging whitewater in the salmon watershed. And all the guides that were rowing dories had no idea really what was up there, other than we know that it's hard. And so I eventually talked to a few more people and got a little bit of a sense of what was going on up there, and found a few of my contemporary guides who weren't hardshell kayakers, but we were able to borrow some duckies, and we did a summertime low water trip on the South Salmon. And it was, like I said, summertime, August flows, it was low, but it's, again, still a totally delightful trip with great camping and great water, and that same kind of sense of, we don't know what's down there. We actually we didn't have a guidebook for that one like we had for the Illinois. What we did have was a page out of a gazetteer like road atlas that had the South Salmon on it, and that was our river map for the trip. So we tore out that page and folded it up, stuck it in a dry bag, and went for it. And I did paddle my hard shell on that trip, and that was my first. I guess that was probably before a couple of those Illinois trips, because I remember that being my very first self-support kayak trip. So that started to, again, open up new doors. And I think a lot of people can relate to the feeling of opportunity that exists when you start doing self-support trips and realize that you can just go and be out for days and days and your boat still paddles well, and it's all good, and it's super fun.
Yeah. No better feeling than pulling over on the side of the river and realizing everything you need is right in the back of your boat, right?
Yeah. And like waking up in the morning and knowing that you don't have to set shuttle. All you have to do is go about a very simple routine, and then you get to go kayaking all day long. So that was another pretty special, exciting trip for me. I was still in college when I did that, and so that was in the summertime, and then in September I'd go back down to Ashland and back to school, and there was another river that really had my attention. Was this tributary to the Klamath that flows into the Klamath River from the north near the town of Happy Camp, and this little stream called Clear Creek. And Clear Creek is very similar to Vallecito Creek in the sense that it drains complete wilderness area. There's a trail up the creek the whole way, but that's kind of the main access to it. And there's like a class 2 run at the bottom that's a spectacular beginner kayak run, super scenic. And then there's a really high quality class 4 or 5 run with a short hike in just above the trailhead. So really similar general layout to Vallecito Creek, but not nearly as much on the radar. There's not so much of a paddling community there. But I had been running Clear Creek a few times, and that upper Clear Creek run that we would do with the 1 mile hike in, that was the first time I ever thought about carrying my kayak into something to run it. And that was another very cool experience, but I remember just absolutely suffering from a 1 mile hike in. And deciding that it was worth it, but feeling like that was about as much as I had available to me. And then I, see these videos from No Big Names or Liquid Lifestyles or whatever of people going into Upper Cherry Creek and hiking 11 miles up and over mountain passes with fully loaded boats and everything. And I was like, man, that is so next level. That is so impressive that people are out there doing stuff that hard. That'll certainly never be part of my scene, but just cool to know that exists. But going back to Clear Creek had that same, had some of that allure to me. And I started studying maps. Somebody had mentioned that what is upstream of that bridge where we would put in at was just another 14 miles of runnable whitewater that nobody really knew much about. And it had been run before, but I got to work with studying the drainage, and I'd go to the school library and pull out their USGS topo quads, big paper maps, and learned how to plot gradient by taking a piece of string, and you'd like run the string along the water course, the blue line on the map, and then you'd measure how long that string was and go to the map scale and say, okay, that was 14.2 miles. Now let's look at the contours and calculate how much elevation it had dropped, and doing this like really kind of old school strategy. And that's how we figured out river gradient at the time, was with that kind of map work. And
you were very curious even early on about all that stuff.
And I was so curious about it with that particular run that I think I went into the library. I knew exactly where to find that map, exactly which cabinet it was in. And I would go in there. I probably went in 5 times and mapped and
That's awesome.
Remapped out the gradient just because I was so interested in it. But I knew that if I couldn't carry my boat 1 mile in to run that upper section, I certainly wasn't going to carry it another 14 miles up the trail to run what was up above. And there was an option of getting into it from the upstream side. And there was a 6 mile hike option that was mostly downhill to get you in
Hmm.
at the top. And so that seemed pretty appealing. But then the logistics of it didn't really pan out with the way that the Oregon Coast Range gets snow, because the road to get there would get gated off every year.
Hmm.
And so once the first snow fell, getting up to that access point was no longer an option. And then the road wouldn't get plowed at all, and it had one spot where it went across the north face of a mountain, and so that area just got such little sun exposure that it usually wouldn't melt out until June or July. And the only tale I had heard of anybody running what was up there was some notion that Dustin and Brandon Knapp had run it at super low flow several years before.
Oh,
Um,
really?
and so I would then, you know, get online and look at the USGS gauge pages, and I'd study the hydrographs for the indicator gauges around there, and I was paying tons of attention to the like what it took to get runnable flows early in the season. And every year for like 4 years, as we would get close to the beginning of the fall rain season, as we're into like October and November, I'd be paying attention uh, to weather forecasts and storms that were going to come in as long as that gate was still open, thinking that like we got to be ready to pull the trigger on this and get out there, because I know that it happens every year that we can get in there and run it. We just have to
Hmm.
be queued up and ready. Um, and the biggest problem challenge I found was just finding a partner, because at this point I didn't have anybody in that neck of the woods that was fired up to go work hard to paddle class 4 whitewater. There were plenty of folks that wanted to work hard to paddle whitewater, but that was like
Hmm.
Darren McCoy and Ben Stooksbury
Hmm. Yeah, they
and
were
Chris
looking for the
Korbulik.
big
And so
the
those
edge.
guys
Yeah.
are like off in Mexico running firsties on the El Seca or something, when I want to just go run some like piddly little class 3-4 wilderness run. Um, but eventually I was able to connect the dots, and found two guys that at the last minute were fired up. I hadn't ever paddled with either of them before, but we threw together the mission and found a shuttle driver and put it together to go poke into Clear Creek. And so that was, I guess, my first time really ramping up the notion of carrying a loaded boat in to somewhere to run some rapids. Um, and that was probably 2007, 2008, right around the time that I was graduating from college and kind of wandering about trying to figure out what the next move was with life. But one thing that was very certain was that I was just having an absolute blast with this notion of semi-exploratory kayaking. And
Hmm.
I was dabbling into class 5 at the time, but certainly wasn't one to call myself a class 5 boater. And then following the following summer, as we were guiding up in Idaho, my brother and a good friend of his had done a trip to Chile a few years prior, and they were fired up to do a return to Chile. But they didn't want to just do a return to Chile. They also wanted to go check out some big expeditions in Peru. So
Hmm.
Peru started to come across our radar, and that was my first trip out of the country, really. But
Hmm.
we, over the course of the summer, we kept the conversations going. The stoke was there, and we figured out the logistics of how we were going to get down there at least, and we did the whole thing of wrapping boats up and lying to the ticket agents about what's
Yeah.
inside, and
Checking in your wave ski.
and yeah, managed to get our three wave skis on the airplane, and flew down to Lima. and then from there bumped over to Cusco with Kurt Casey's Peru Whitewater website bookmarked on all of our Google profiles. So we
Nice.
got down there and had a little bit of a hit list of what we wanted to do. Some of the main classics were the Colca and Cotahuasi and the Apurimac. And then there was this one other trip that was a little bit more obscure. It had been run before, but it was called the Paucartambo, or that's how a lot of people referred to it. I think the river is actually called the Mapacho locally, but the put-in is in a town called Paucartambo. And we, by the time we got down there and were looking at, by the time we got down to Cusco and we were getting ready to mobilize for trips, our group had grown to 5. We had met another guy from the U.S. and someone from the Netherlands, and the 5 of us decided to go for it with the Paucartambo, and that was by far the most intimidating trip I had ever set out on. We had, I think, a kind of cryptic write-up on Kurt Casey's website, and then there was also a blog article that had been written up, and there were references for the most part to like high quality class 4 with some class 5 kayaking, but then there were also some references to some pretty big portages, some pretty nasty sieve sections, some locked in gorges, and one particular reference to like a unportageable, unscoutable gorge that was class 6 with a class 5 sneak that people were able to scout from a boulder in the middle of the river at the top. And I was very much just kind of deferring to the expertise of the more senior paddlers in the group that all had confidence that was something we could do. And the Mapacho run from put in to takeout is about 150 miles, and it drops something like 8,500 vertical feet. So it's just a marvelous gradient profile of, at the end of the day, really most of it is class 4 plus paddling with a handful of class 5. And we ended up taking 10 days to piece that one together. And of course, no one in the group had done it before, but man, I remember loading our boats with 10 days full of food, and we couldn't even pick them up to carry them down to the river. When we did get to some of the big portages, there were times that we would didn't have the strength to lift our boats and shoulder them over talus piles, so we would fully unload our boats and then carry all the bags to the end of the portage, and then backtrack to the beginning and carry our boats. Of course, also navigating some of the fatigue and malnutrition that was inevitably setting in as we weren't really super well prepared nutrition-wise, and just exhausted, didn't have the level of like endurance that I guess we just weren't really aware. I at least wasn't aware of the need to have that kind of endurance. I was still pretty young, and didn't understand the distinction between like day trip fitness and expedition fitness.
Those just long days of not just paddling, but getting in and out of your boat, jumping over rocks to scout things, carrying your boat, all that kind of stuff adds up.
Totally.
Yeah.
But so, I mean, that trip went off, I think for the most part without a hitch. It was a really successful trip. We lost a paddle on the first day. After a couple days, you get to a couple of bridges that are the places where you start to think about whether you want to hike out or not, but nobody was really having those conversations, so I didn't think that was an option, and we just kind of persisted. I definitely was out of my element on that, and I never would have been successful on that trip if it wasn't, especially for this guy named Case, the Dutch guy on the trip. He was a pro level paddler, and he would run rapids blind and then catch little micro eddies, give us like whistles, and then to a point where we could just roll up at the horizon line, and I wasn't even really looking at the river. I was just looking at him, knowing that he would be pointing me to the left or the right or whatever, and telling me where I needed to go. I was still very much a formative in my developing my ability to read water and read and run
Yeah.
stuff. But
Yeah.
with all of that support that I had from much more proficient paddlers, was able to successfully complete the run and have a really great time.
Hmm.
And
Sounds like a good lesson in who your team is too, huh? Like
absolutely.
I was thinking at the outset when you said that, that's pretty ambitious one to tackle, not having much experience in expedition and not outside of the country at all. Like that's a pretty remote one.
Yeah, and we, as we were hanging out in our like hostel room in Cusco, we were talking about some of the different options that we had. We had already tagged along on a commercial trip and kayaked the Apurimac, the commercial section. We did not do the Abismo, but the pretty classic section closer to Cusco. And that had gone well, and the guides were telling us about some different options of rivers beyond the things on our hit list that we came in with. And one of the other contenders for us to check out during that time was a river called the Tambopata, where we had an opportunity to join a commercial trip that was going down there. And that was the Tambopata is like a class 2-3 river. It's a scenic river, but it takes you through a really remote and undisturbed section of the Amazon rainforest. And so it gets
Cool.
like the main attraction there is kind of wildlife viewing. And apparently the logistics for it involve like you get down to the flatwater sections and then climb onto more of a barge houseboat style craft that
Oh.
floats you down uh, for several days of wildlife viewing, and then you get to a small town that has an airstrip and they fly you out. So that's the sort of thing that is way more difficult to DIY those kinds of logistics. And so we had this opportunity to check out the Tambopata, and there was a big part of me that was really hoping we'd just go do that and look at birds for 10 days instead of dealing with class 5 plus unportageable gorged in canyons with scary seal launch sneak lines. And for the record, I mean, I think that river changes pretty dramatically with flows, and it's just such a dynamic system. But we never ran into anything that met that description. We did run into some of the portages that were described, but everything that was gorged in, when we did get to what we think was they were referring to, I don't think we even had to scout it. So,
yeah, I did that one too. I think after you did it.
Oh, nice.
Not as long of a section either, because there was more roads, I think, probably built in the interim. But same. I remember. I mean, we did some portages. None of them were horrendous, and you could scout everything.
Just a couple other like quick kind of formative trips for me as I continued pushing myself and really aiming for these expeditions and feeling more and more confidence with showing ourselves down stuff. After paddling the Mapacho, we went down to Chile because we wanted to run some waterfalls. So we had a pretty typical session in Pucón for a while, running the Yancahue and the Palguin and the Golgol and the Fui and whatever else. Most of those were repeats for Mike and Zach, who had been down there a few years before. But I remember being in one of the kayak shops in Pucón and picking up this little paddling magazine, and there was a Chilean published whitewater magazine that was that I think the first issue of had come out, and I don't know if it's it's probably not something that they kept up with for very long, but on dull days when we couldn't go kayaking because we didn't have a truck, we would go and just sit in the kayak shop, and I'd pick up this magazine and read through it. And there was this article in there about a trip that some folks had done. It was written by Marion Sather, and they had done this trip deep in Patagonia where they hired a float plane to fly them in to this lake, and then they put in on the little outflow of that lake that brought them down to a river called the Rio Bravo, and they paddled the
Mm.
Rio Bravo through committing gorges and class 4 and class 5 whitewater, all the way down to the ocean. And I think the logistic that they had is they even like went to the ocean and paddled over to a ferry crossing, and they intercepted a ferry that was
Wow.
out in the channel in the fjord, and jumped on the ferry to bring him back to the mainland. And that just sounded like such a incredible trip. Uh, and the It sounded like this spectacular trip, and it also, the description of it was kind of in that class 4 or 5 difficulty range that I was feeling more comfortable with. So it felt like if we could go do something like the Mapacho, then maybe I could go do something like the Bravo. And it wasn't in the cards for that trip, but it definitely planted a seed for me. And it was uh, probably another 3 years later that my traveling companion, Zach, from that trip, Zach was really fired up about the Rio Bacher. And that was the river from the trip that he didn't get an opportunity to do and really wanted to return for. And I was really fired up about the Rio Bravo. And so he and I started cooking up this idea of going down there. And he really brought most of the fire because there were plans in action for damming of the Rio Bacher and damming of the Rio
Right.
Pascua. And so it seemed at the time like the Bacher was living on borrowed time, and if we wanted to get down there, we needed to do it while we could. So um, we put together this trip I think it was the spring of 2012, and we just put together this real smash and grab mission where our idea was to fly down to Santiago, and then from there with our boats bust down to Puerto Montt, immediately start making our way further south and just get down to the Bacher as soon as we could to paddle that, and then head from there straight to the Bravo. As we were planning this trip, in response to some of the dam construction that was being proposed, basically the entire southern third of the nation of Chile went on strike. There were massive paros, which is the Spanish word for strike, massive paros and roadblocks and protests going on all over the place. And in Patagonia, in Chilean Patagonia, there's only one road. It's the Carretera Austral.
Right.
It's that road or bust. And in response to these foreign-backed plans to build 5 massive dams and then transmission lines to run electricity 3,000 miles north to the copper mines, the locals basically shut down that part of the country. They shut down the ports. They shut down the highway. They were cutting down trees that were 5 feet in diameter to block the highway. They were piling
Whoa.
up like truckloads of tires and lighting them on fire in the middle of the
Oh my
highway.
God.
They
It's a legit
they were
strike.
going into full self-sufficiency mode, and basically saying like no one else can come here right now, and shut down all imports of fuel. So gas wasn't available at any pumps. And we're looking at this and we're like, man, how is this going to play out? Like, we definitely cannot show up there right now and make it anywhere close to the Rio Bacher. But
Yeah.
Zach just had it in his mind that it would work out, that we could get down there and figure it
Really?
out. So against all better judgment, we still spent like $1,200 on plane tickets and went down there with boats. We got to bus down to Puerto Montt, where the main highway ends, and we have to get on the ferry, and decided that was our best bet to get a rental car. And we started weighing our options. We could either spend, $60 a day to get a cheap hatchback, or we could spend $130 a day to get a Mitsubishi pickup. And the pickup was obviously way, way more capable of handling the terrain of the Carretera Austral, but that wasn't our only issue. We needed fuel, and we we were hopeful that the various road blockades would be something that they would like. We didn't know about 5-foot diameter trees and tire fires covering the highway. We just thought that it was like people with vehicles blocking off supply trucks from coming in, and we had these like
Right.
noble ideas that maybe we'll show up here and they'll allow us to uh, they'll allow us to roll through because we have these like virtuous notions of promoting recreation on the rivers that they're trying to protect. So maybe since we're on their side, they'll look kindly upon us. Um, and so we ended up deciding to go with the little hatchback car, and our plan, we kind of ran the numbers on it and figured we might not be able to refill our gas tanks the entire way from here to the Bacher. So we need to show up with enough
Oh my
fuel to
God.
get all the way down there. So in the day that we are like in the morning, we arrived in Puerto Montt on an overnight bus. That morning, we learned that we're on a 3-week itinerary. We got return tickets. We don't have all day, so or all year to pull off this trip. So in
Right.
that day, in that morning, we went to the ferry terminal. We learned that there was a ferry leaving that afternoon, and there wasn't going to be another one for 4 days. So we bought a ticket on that ferry. Then we went and found ourselves a rental car. Then we went to the hardware store and bought like 200 gallons worth of liquid storage in drums and
Oh my God.
jugs. Drove to the supermarket, stocked up on food, and then drove to the gas station and spent $400 on gasoline with all these bins that were inside of our vehicle, and then barely caught our ferry. And
It's dedication.
basically the day we got on that ferry was the day that all of the strikeage stopped. And
Nice.
our timing could not have been better. We got down to the Carretera Austral and started driving our way south. And whenever we'd run out of get low on gas, we'd refill with our little section of garden hose. And we and as we were cruising through some of these communities, we were driving through car wide gaps in these old growth trees that had been felled across the road.
Wow.
And like you could smell the sawdust from them having just cleared these things out. There were tire fires we drove past that were still smoldering. And when we got down to Coyhaique, the filling station there had just gotten fuel delivered, and the line to at the pump was half a mile long. So we were pretty psyched that we didn't really need all of
Yeah.
that fuel, but we were psyched that we had it. It worked out
Worked
well
out.
for us, and
That's
we ended
wild.
up we ended up getting down there and paddled the Fuda for a day. Did a quick top to bottom as a warm up, and then made tracks for the Bacher and spent a couple days paddling there, getting our worlds rocked, and then loaded up and made our way down to the Bravo. And the between our first trip down and that trip, no one had returned to the Bravo because the only guy flying a float plane in the area had moved out of the country, so there wasn't really a way for people to get to it.
Hmm.
But the Marianne and Ron Fisher were also kind of interested. We had dialogue with them, and they were interested in getting back onto the Bravo, and they had cooked up another access that you couldn't fly in, but instead of flying into that lake, you could drive not to that lake, but you could drive to a different lake, and then you could paddle 13 kilometers into a 20-mile-an-hour headwind across that lake. Then you could shoulder your boat and hike up and over a small pass to get to the second lake, and then paddle another 12 or 13 kilometers into a 20-mile-an-hour
Good man.
headwind in whitecaps to get to the far end of that lake. And that's what we did.
Nice.
It was probably the hardest paddling I've ever done, but
Hmm.
over the course of 2 days, we made it across both of the lakes, and then got to the outflow and started working our way down the Rio Alegre and got to the Bravo. Spent the next 3 days just kind of picking it apart. There were 3 of us on that trip, and that was by far the most elementally challenging trip I've ever done. I think that we would get a short break from the weather for about 2 hours every evening, and just enough that we could get a little fire going, a little warming fire. But other than that, it was raining on us the entire time
Oh,
with like 38
Jesus.
degree rain. And none of us
Oh,
had pogies. Big mistake.
oh,
Anybody going to the Bravo, bring pogies.
that sounds brutal.
It was pretty rough, but I was a lot younger then, and I think that played a big role in my tolerance for the suffer factor there. And my dry suit was pretty new. There were 3 of us sleeping in a mega mid, and the 3 of us would cram into the mega mid with our dry suits, and then in the morning we'd take turns getting out of our sleeping bags straight into our dry suits, and then take the tent down, make a quick breakfast, pack up the boats, and keep going. And I guess that was probably the first trip I did that held that notion of being kind of a second descent and having some and there
Hmm.
having
That's
some
pretty cool.
level of like uh, maybe importance to it or novelty. I guess the Clear Creek trip
Yeah.
that I did
Yeah.
had a fair bit of novelty in that we only knew of people who
Was
had done it in
was the
bone zone
whitewater
flows.
was the whitewater on the Bravo pretty worthy?
The whitewater on the Bravo is outstanding. It flows through these ultra committing gorges, but all of them are class 4, 5 minus.
Hmm.
And the biggest rapids, there's some solid class 5 in there, but all doable class 5. I've always kind of considered myself at my peak to be kind of an average class 5 boater, and the Bravo was right there in the comfort zone. It's not the sort of thing that's limited to only the most elite paddlers. And the wilderness experience out there is incredible, and the gorges are just absolutely fantastic. The And yeah, I mean, even in spite of all the challenges that we faced with brutal temperatures, it's a river I would go back to for sure, and have recommended it to many people. And it definitely gets high praise from some of the top pros out there when they are down in that area. It's become a part of what they refer to as the Patagonia Triple Crown, which is the Bacher, the Bravo, and the Pasqua. And the Bravo is definitely the easiest of those, and I think generally gets considered as like the happy playtime run of the 3, the comfort zone run for people who are of the level to run the Pasqua. There was one pretty memorable moment in there where there was a rapid that was totally unscoutable in a locked in gorge, 800-foot walls coming straight out of the river right above us, and the we couldn't see the rapid. We could get out of our boats at the top of it, but then we're just looking downstream and kind of speculating which of these horizon lines might be the most good to go. And there was an option in there of we were kind of scouting on the right side, and there was an option to scout from the left, but doing so would commit us to running the left, and the left was and it wasn't portageable on either side. So we sat there for probably 20 minutes trying to convince ourselves that something was good. There was a horizon line directly downstream of us. It looked like maybe a 10-foot drop, looked like it was a pretty clean lip, probably a good clean boof, but you could see from above that there was a rock mid-channel directly downstream of it. And so we couldn't tell if there might be a rock in the landing zone. And we just didn't have any options other than, it seemed like, other than somebody deciding they wanted to go ahead and just send it. But none of us were of that mindset. And eventually I threw out this idea to the other two guys that with a little bit of a sales pitch, they agreed had a lot of merit to it. And that idea was that the water leading up to that drop was relatively slow moving, and so we decided that it would be feasible to take two of our throw bags, tie them together, and then tie one end of that throw bag onto the rescue harness on my PFD. And I put on some neoprene mitts that one of the guys did have, no pogies, but someone did have mitts. And then I just went like full immersion in my dry suit in the river and had them belay me down right to the edge of that drop. And it was 3 feet deep or whatever. So with the support of the throw bag, I was able to stand up and scout the drop from where we would be taking our stroke, basically. And sure enough, it was clean. So I gave them the good to go sign, and they started pulling me back upstream and yarded me back up to my boat, and then the three of us climbed back in our kayaks and went and fired it off.
So nice. Sounds like a proper adventure.
That was kind of a fun little problem-solving highlight in there. And that trip was really like the last hurrah for me before I started getting into more of career life. I took a job. I was starting a job the next fall as a high school teacher, and getting away from the like nomadic river guide, winters free to do whatever I wanted kind of program. And I took a job working in Cascade, Idaho, and spent the next 3 years there. Really pretty excited to have a little bit more stability in my life, and still getting to do quite a bit of paddling. The school I was teaching for had a bit of a paddling program to it, not on the level of like World Class Kayak Academy, but it's a program called the Alzar School, and we would teach outdoor leadership, and we'd take the kids kayaking, and mostly run class 2-3, but there were always opportunities where we were to paddle harder stuff. So, and I lived in Cascade, so we had Kelly's Play Park right there. I could go play boating and stay in shape, and then was 20-minute drive from the put in for the top of the North Fork. Yeah, so in the time that I was there, the North Fork is another one of those rivers that my experience with it was mostly figuring it out for myself. I found people to paddle with, but most people, when they run the North Fork, the prevailing wisdom is when you run the North Fork, just go to the put in, find some locals that'll let you tag along, and just follow a helmet all the way down. And I never had that experience on the North Fork. I mostly paddled on the upper section, and definitely found some people who knew their way around down there, but I really didn't like the idea at that point in my career of just following a helmet. I wanted to know what was going on. So I had the capacity and the bandwidth to scout things from the road, and so I started piecing together what all the lines were through the whole section and all these little obscure rapids that most people have never taken a look at, and got to a point where I wasn't just following a helmet down, but I really knew where I was down there, and I was one of the helmets that people were following.
Very
So
cool.
I got a real strong level of comfort with the North Fork. I still had a pretty tough relationship with Nutcracker and Jake's, um, but I hit my head pretty hard on steepness one day, and another time on Nutcracker. So I was still pretty leery of those rapids. I'd run them sometimes, but definitely not doing top to bottoms every time. The other river that I got really closely acquainted with was the South Salmon, which of course I had done a long time
Hmm.
before, but uh, had not really gotten comfortable with it at high water. And so once I was living in Cascade, I started doing South Salmon trips several times a year at 5 feet, 6 feet, 7 feet on the gauge, and got to be a little bit of a local there as well. And so when people were coming through, I would get phone calls and invitations to come on South Salmon trips several times a year, and made a good solid point of getting in there most weekends that I was
Yeah,
off during the spring.
that, that's awesome.
Um,
What a great way.
so
It's
I
funny.
had,
It's fun. I was
go
fun
ahead.
to interrupt for a second. It's funny to me that you mentioned scouting the North Fork of the Payette because I've been, I've been I've been catching up on whitewater kayaking interviews. I kind of took a hiatus for a while there, but I was listening to this one with Charlie Muncie, right? Who's of course like kind of Scott Lindgren's
Yeah.
right hand man on a lot of these trips, and uh, he actually, I mean, if you haven't listened to him, you would love it because he has this very similar philosophy to you that it's about even if it's a run that's been done before, like there's so much value in going in and doing it yourself. But the one run he mentioned that you should just follow someone is the North Fork of the Payette.
Yeah, and I by and large agree with that. I've had lots of people follow me down different sections there. It's because it's a lot to take in. It, it if you're going to show up there, it's going to take you a long time to figure out all the pieces and feel like you can be somewhere in the middle five, in the middle of chaos or peck major, and understand where you are and know what to do.
Yeah. But if you have the
Um,
time, you probably have a much better map in your head of the rapids than most people do.
yeah. Um, and so that brought me to like 2015, and I was feeling kind of at the top of my game. The second time that I had ever run the Little White, it was a similar kind of trip where like I had run it a few days before getting shown down, but then my second time down, I had a bunch of friends that had never done it before, and I was showing them down, and
Hmm.
I felt a lot of empowerment on like my abilities to just figure out runs and show myself down the river, and that was just a very exciting place to be. At the same time, I didn't like living in Cascade as a kayaker because of the North Fork. I didn't like the idea of that being the river that I was going to paddle for 20 times a year as I went into my 30s and 40s and potentially 50s as a kayaker, because it just scares me, and it still
Mm.
does. And I would have fun, but always kind of like type 1.5 fun on the North Fork.
Hmm.
And I wanted to have other rivers available to me that would challenge me, but be uh, more of type 1 fun. And so I was ready to find the next place, and I left Cascade, and I ended up taking a job teaching high school again down in Durango, and that was a super exciting transition for me. Um, but I I wasn't all that excited about kayaking anymore. I was losing some of my fire when I got down there, and there were several components to that. Part of it is that I adopted a dog, and having an athletic dog just isn't very compatible with being a kayaker. Like, he needed to run, and so I couldn't go boating. I had to go mountain biking. And I also, as kind of a like celebratory send off, I decided to, right before leaving Cascade, like 2 days before I moved away, I went and ran a top to bottom with a friend of mine. And going into Jake's, I missed my line at Rodeo Hole, flipped over, rolled up, but wasn't in a place to catch the eddy at rock drop, so I got like stuffed into the seam there, flipped over, rolled up, was sideways with no momentum going into the wrong spot on taffy puller, flipped over, rolled up at the bottom, and as I rolled up there, I was getting pushed up against a rock they call the witch's tit, and was just gassed, flipped over again, still all of golf course ahead of me, and
Oof.
was able to roll up and paddled the shore. But man, that just scared the shit out of me.
Yeah, for
And
good reason.
so I started thinking, maybe if I want to be focused on adventure longevity, I should branch out from kayaking a little bit. And so I moved to Durango with desire to check out some of the runs that I had been hearing about so much, but certainly nowhere near the fire that I had previously to go and like develop a crew. And so I was a little slow to develop a crew of paddlers in Durango. I met up with some younger guys. A guy named Paul Ramseth was kind enough to invite me on a Black Canyon trip a couple months after I moved there. So the first run I ever did in Colorado was Black Canyon at the Gunnison, and in the whole summer leading up to that, I had probably only carried my boat on my shoulder for a grand total of like 100 steps over the course of 20 laps on the North Fork. And so I had shouldered my boat on Black Canyon more than I had the entire summer before we even got to the real portage. Just portaging some of the like day wrecker and
Yeah, totally.
ball crusher and triple drop and that stuff. And then so we got to the portage, and I just got obliterated on that portage. I think I took over 2 hours to get down to Cave
Oof.
Camp, and I was smoked. And had a great time in there. Thought it was super cool, but that was a good wake up to what it feels like to be a kayaker in Durango, where you don't get to go kayaking unless you want to carry your boat. And whether it's Baker's or even Upper Animas, you're carrying your boat out, via Cedo trips, Third Gorge of Lime, everything, you're carrying your boat. So between some of that and the really short season in Durango, relative to Idaho, I should say. I mean, the paddling in Durango is outstanding, but the snowmelt season is just a few months, and this excitement for mountain biking, I just kind of stopped kayaking nearly as much as I had. But the one person that I did connect with was this guy Jeff Kramer, and he was not a kayaker, unequivocally not a kayaker, but he was probably and is probably the most competent backcountry traveler that I have ever been on a trip with. And he had come with a climbing background and canyoneering background and backpacking background and backcountry skiing experience. And the packraft was like the sixth element to his quiver. And he was fired up about packrafting, and had paddled some of the local stuff, but mostly was paddling class 2-3. He was a grad school friend of my roommate, and so we would go over to his place for dinners and drink beer on the front porch together, and he was always telling me stories about packrafting. And I was curious, but I was also like fairly dismissive because I had judgments around packrafting. And and eventually, but I also didn't have a whole lot of kayaking partners in Durango. So when Memorial Day weekend came around the next year, he suggested that we go to BV and paddle on the Arkansas. And I had heard about the Arkansas, wanted to check it out, and didn't have anyone else to paddle with. So I was like, yeah, sure, why not? I'll go paddle with this dude in a pack raft and see what it's all about. And so he and I drove out there and camped out for a couple days and ran laps on the numbers. And he was so much of not a kayaker that like he didn't even know the right words to say. He didn't even know the right like clothes to wear as a kayaker. He wore knee pads. and wore a wetsuit. And he kept talking about this like maneuver in rapids of trying to overtop holes. And I eventually put it together that what he was talking about was keeping his bow up and boofing over foam piles. But uh, but definitely was just like, man, who is this clown? And
But kind of like that seems like classic pack rafter background though, right? Like you're sort of like more interested in traveling around on land, and you're like, oh, but there's some rivers here, and it would be handy if I had this little thing that I could float down some of these rivers with.
Totally. Yeah. And I mean, he had been doing some backcountry trips and just came up with, like, recognized how much his trips could change if he had access to a, if he could travel down the rivers. So he got himself a pack raft and was teaching himself how to paddle. And at the time, he certainly couldn't roll. I don't think his boat even had thigh straps at the time. But he convinced me to take a shot at paddling his packraft through one of the rapids on the Numbers, and I took him up on it and got in his boat and paddled down, and I was really impressed. I was like, oh, this, like, yeah, you can take real strokes in here even without thigh straps. I can still kind of tip this thing side to side a little bit. I can I wouldn't call it edging, but I can certainly like tilt my boat to the side, and I can catch eddies, and I can, do a quick bow draw and really whip this thing around and ferry and surf and things like that.
Pretty intuitive for you though, right off the bat.
I can overtop some holes.
You can overtop some holes.
I can overtop some holes in this thing. It's got so much rocker, and the bow doesn't weigh anything. I can really lift it up. And yeah, it was super intuitive. And even without thigh straps, it had a spray deck, so I was still kind of enclosed in the boat a little bit. And so I get back to Durango and reach out to the. So I start entertaining the idea of pack rafting a little bit more. I was teaching swiftwater rescue courses at the time, and so there was a growing market for teaching pack raft specific rescue courses, and so that was part of my original excuse for deciding, like, oh yeah, okay, I'll dabble with pack rafting because I can monetize it. Because then I can start teaching these courses.
Professional growth.
Yeah. And so I ended up demoing, meeting up with one of the owners of Alpaca Raft at the play park in Durango, and demoing a boat that they made that was kind of their experimental lab boat. That was the intention of it was to be the most capable whitewater pack raft that had ever been made. And that was a boat called the Alpacalypse. So time check here, this is still like 2015. This is very much not the landscape of pack rafting that exists today. And the way I think of it, there are kind of three generations of pack rafts. There were the early pack rafts that were super lightweight, oftentimes like bucket boats, just everything focused on being as lightweight as possible, and a backpacking accessory that were great for floating down, totally capable of floating down class 1 and 2 rivers, and you could, but you'd get pretty wet paddling them, and you'd take your backpack and strap it onto the front of the boat, and if you fall out, then everything gets soaked, and not a very capable boat, but in terms of whitewater, but a great backpacking accessory. And then the middle generation would be this Alpacalypse boat, which some of the more popular selling models of the same generation were like the Narwhal and the Wolverine. And those boats incorporated a spray skirt with a semi-legitimate deck with a cockpit rim, included the cargo zipper in the back. So part of the thing with these newer pack rafts is there's a zipper that you open up, kind of like a dry suit zipper, but it's actually designed to hold 3 to 5 psi of pressure. And so that's integrated into the boat. And when you open up this zipper, it gives you access to the entire inflation chamber of the boat. And that becomes storage area for you. So in a self-support kayak trip, you've got your dry bags that you stuff into your stern behind the seat. With a pack raft, you don't have to have dry bags. You can just have stuff sacks that you put inside the dry storage of the boat itself, and then you can
Hmm.
push those further forward. And you can even have them in front of you, or you can have them right next to you, so you get better
Hmm.
weight distribution. Um, and then having spray skirt, those cargo zippers, and thigh straps, I think, were kind of the main pieces that really amplified the performance of those boats. And so those were something that you could roll, you could boof, you could edge a little bit more, and by getting that internal storage, you get a nice low center of gravity, and you can run long big water rapids and not get your boat totally swamped. So that
Hmm.
like really blew up the capability of these boats. And um,
How much buoyancy do they have compared to a kayak? In like if you load these things up, like are they
yeah,
equivalently less buoyant or?
good question. They're quite a bit more buoyant. And that's
Hmm.
because the displacement volume of the inflated tubes ends up
Mm.
being quite a bit more than the displacement volume of most creek boats. So
Hmm.
my creek boat is paddling medium Nirvana, and that's probably like 85 gallons or something.
Mm-hmm.
My I can't remember what the volume estimates on the large Valkyrie are, but it's something like 130 gallons.
Oh, significantly more.
So yeah, it's quite a bit more, and a lot of that comes from the width of the boats, which is
That makes sense.
necessary because of the inflatable tubes. So there's kind of this like minimum width that has to be achieved just by the construction limitations. But that width has been decreased considerably from the Alpacalypse version 10 years ago to the Valkyries that we're paddling these days, and
Hmm.
that contributes dramatically to the performance of the boats.
But with
Um,
similar volume, just redistributed.
yeah, and potentially, yeah, I think probably similar volume because the tubes are narrower, but the boat is longer, so
I
you've
see.
got maybe more volume overall in the stern. Um, And so, yeah, I mean, I think the questions that I get most commonly about the pack raft are like, how much does it weigh? And those earlier boats, the Alpacalypse was like 10 pounds, the Valkyrie is 15. Can you roll it? Yes, absolutely. Not as easily as a hardshell kayak. My roll is not as dependable as it is in my Nirvana, um, but you can absolutely roll up, and we definitely make choices to run rapid sometimes with an understanding that, like, yeah, it's okay to get flipped over in that feature because I'm pretty confident that I'll roll up.
Hmm.
That was not the case 10 years ago. 10 years
Mm.
ago, my roll in whitewater with the Alpacalypse was probably like 50%. So it means
Well,
50% of the time that I flip over, I'm swimming. Now, when people hear that, that sounds initially super sketchy. And I will say that it is way less sketchy in a pack raft because A, you can self-rescue. You can just flip the boat back over and get right back in. If you don't self-rescue, if you're not able to, you still have this super buoyant thing next to you because the boat didn't fill up with water. It still has
right.
all the inflated space keeping that thing afloat, unlike a creek boat that now just has the 30 gallons, 20 gallons of inflated float bags in the back. This thing still has 100 gallons of buoyancy. And so you can use that as something to hold on to and make your swim less bad if you're swimming in big water. Um, and then I guess lastly, the pack rafts, if you do get separated from them, they very seldom just get lost downriver. Like a kayak is just going to take off and keep going if
Mm.
somebody's
Same,
not super vigilant about clipping
s-
into it and
s-
towing it to shore.
same reason, I guess. It's not filled up with water, so it's just moving
Yeah,
down a
it
lot more
still is
controlled.
sitting on top of the water, and so a little bit of wind will blow it to shore. And if it does get stuck on rocks, it doesn't get pinned under the surface. It just gets washed up on the rocks. We have experienced very few packraft pins in all of our missions.
Huh. What do you do for inflation? You must bring something to inflate it on the river, right?
Yeah. Um, so they make this bag that you can think of as basically a pillowcase that has a little adapter to connect to the valve at the bottom. And the idea is that you use this big pillowcase, you fill it up with air, and then you give it a big bear hug and force a bunch of
Hmm.
air into the chamber.
Really?
And if you use that thing, then you can get it inflated. And if you know how to do it, it takes like 20 seconds, 30 seconds.
No way.
You can't pressurize it with those bags, but then we would typically use our mouths to pressurize them. And that was
Okay.
certainly the case back in 2015, 2016. More recently, in the last 5 years, Alpaca has started marketing and selling, or manufacturing and selling this little pump that is a super compact version of a raft pump, basically. And and so we use that to top it off and get pressure. Uh, and and then we'll keep that handy and keep our boats topped off during the day. But on our lightweight trips, we typically don't bother bringing our inflation bags with us anymore because you get enough of the volume of the boat filled up just by putting the dry bags inside, and
Hmm.
and then you can just fill it the rest of the way with like 15 breaths. So
Hmm.
then you've got your boat fully inflated and semi-pressurized, and then you top it off with the pump and have something that's a lot more stiff and rigid.
Hmm. Amazing. Sounds like it's amazingly quick.
Yeah, we had we had a trip last year where, as part of our strategy for going further upstream, we decided it would be fastest for us to just walk at river level on this section between gorges. And while walking the river banks, we still would get cliffed out and have to ferry across here and there. We ended up having to ferry like 5 or 6 times, and each time we just inflated our boats with our mouths without stuffing anything inside them, and decided it really just wasn't that big of a deal. So I'll use an electric pump if I'm doing a car to car run, but otherwise, it's really not terribly obtrusive to inflate by mouth. Um, and then, yeah, I get people ask about the storage of gear. And I guess the last thing that people ask about a lot is the durability. And the durability compared to a hard shell, I would say, is just different. It's not better, but it's also not necessarily worse. And the main reason for that is that patching the boats is really quite feasible and quite successful. So my boat has several punctures in it from all the ringer that it's been through in the last 3 or 4 years, but all of those holes have been patched.
Hmm.
And that's not to say that you can't have some catastrophic failure of something going wrong. If there's the way they're constructed, if there's a hole that's really close to a seam, then it's a lot harder to
Hmm.
get a perfect seal on that seam. But if you
Yeah.
happen to get an abrasion somewhere in the middle of a panel, you can just slap some tape over it, and that'll get you through the rest of the trip. And
Hmm.
then we bring a lot of tape in our repair kits, and then when you get done with the trip, you can uh, do a repair yourself or pay someone to do it professionally and get a patch put on there that is put on with super high-end adhesive that makes a perfect permanent seal, and you're good to go again. So
Nice.
a pack raft that has 10 patches on it is still just as valuable as a new boat. And
Yeah.
whereas a creek boat that has 10 cracks that have been welded in it, like, you're not
It's done.
giving that thing away.
Right.
So, but they do, and they tend to get holes in them through different mechanisms. The pack rafts get holes from abrasion for the most part, and whereas a creek boat gets holes in it from you getting a big gouge in it and then boofing onto a rock
Right.
somewhere or pitoning something.
But are you keeping the thing basically? I mean, are you wearing them out, or are you just replacing them when a new design comes out that you want?
So far, I have not worn out any boats. The Valkyrie has been through several generations in the last few years, and so every time that a new generation comes out, it's been a big enough improvement that I want one. And so I have always
Yeah.
turned over my previous boat, and they hold their value on the used market really well. And they are expensive, and I hear that as a sticking point for a lot of
Mm.
kayakers thinking about getting into it, because you look at a brand new creek boat and you're paying $1,700 or whatever, um, which at the end of the day is really pretty cheap. And then you look at these inflatables that uh, a lot of people are looking at as kind of a gimmick boat that has maybe less utility and certainly less performance, and the sticker price on them is $2,500, and that
Mm.
can be a tough pill to swallow. And I get that. I also, in my own experience, packrafts have been, and especially the Valkyrie, has been the single piece of outdoor recreation equipment that has improved and changed my life the most of
Mm.
anything
That's
out there.
an amazing
Um,
statement.
and and I do a lot of outdoor sports. I'm a backcountry skier. I'm a mountain biker. But if there is one piece of gear I don't want to give up, it's my Valkyrie.
Mm.
And yeah, so people also often are curious about some of the like performance differences, and one of the big ones is how the pack rafts interact with shallow rocks. And again, that's something where they're not necessarily better or worse, just different. So to be more specific, if I'm paddling something at a low flow and it's uh, some like technical run, Vallecito is a fantastic example of this. When we started pack rafting Vallecito Creek, we were running it at lower flow than we would in our hard shells. And you go and run Vallecito Creek at 1.8 on the gauge in a creek boat, and you get to the bottom just wondering why you wasted so much time hiking up there, because you've bounced off of so many boulders that your ankles hurt, and it's just kind of punishing, beats you up. Um, but if there's that kind of like pinball nature of a run, then the pack rafts do a lot better with that, because they don't get deflected through harsh impacts by all of those
Mhm.
little boulders. They have much more capacity to like deform just a little bit and slide over a boulder. So
Mm.
lines that would be really manky in a creek boat are really quite smooth and cruiser and comfortable in a pack raft. And
Nice.
so we eventually did start closing the gap a little bit on flows, and we would start running. We've run Vallecito at 2 feet, 2.1 feet. Um, but most of the pack rafting that we did on Vallecito was at much lower flow. And the cool thing about that is that it just expands the season dramatically. So the like prime flows for running Vallecito as a kayaker are going, if I go with CFS, which is what we really should be going with, then you're looking at like 250 to 400 CFS or something, 250 to 450. That's
Right.
your range of good boatable flows. Um, and a pack raft lowers that range of fun flows, and really I'd say 300 is more of a minimum for kayaking. And so the pack raft lowers your minimum flow range down um, to like 140. So you're kind
Mm.
of
Wow.
doubling the flow range. And since those lower flows are more common, you're often increasing your season of runnable days on Vallecito by 3 or 4 fold. There was a year that uh, that the snowpack was so lousy in the San Juans that Vallecito only ran for like a week, and most local boaters only got 0 or 1 laps on Vallecito. Um, John Baker, I think, did like 32 laps in a month that year.
Mm. Yeah,
Um,
that's huge. This is a good year to buy a pack raft if you want to run Vallecito.
yeah, absolutely. It's going to be a good packraft IA season.
Huh? Yeah, that's super cool. And one of the things you were mentioning to me before, which I thought it was interesting detail because I never thought about it, but you were saying when they prototype these things, they can iterate on the prototypes like way faster than you can for a hard shell kind of kayak. Where I mean, I don't know that they either like obviously making a whole mold is hugely expensive, but still I think they're using like various patched together fiberglass things or something to like try to iterate, but it's very slow relatively speaking.
Yeah, yeah, I don't know that many details on the prototyping process for creek boats, but for hardshell kayaks in general, rotomolded plastic. But yeah, like you said, it's a very slow process, and I think a lot of boats that are coming out don't even ever prototype them. They just like come up with digital models and decide, yeah, we're doing
Yeah.
this.
Yeah.
Let's see how it shakes out and hope for the best. But these packrafts, they are sewn and glued together, and so they are made. They can be made by hand by one person in a day. And there have been periods of the prototyping since I was in Durango and built a friendship with the people who run Alpaca Raft. They looped me in with some of the prototyping process, and I've given them a lot of feedback through the years, especially with the development of the Valkyrie. And there had been periods where we would paddle a boat and then talk about what we experienced with it and what we liked and what we didn't like and what we were noticing, and they'd take a bunch of notes and go back to the shop, and then 2 days later have a completely fresh prototype
Yeah. That's
ready to go.
incredible.
And
Talk about a
uh,
tight loop.
before the river drops out. And I mean, I don't know how many prototypes they've made of the Valkyrie through this whole process, but I wouldn't be surprised if that number is north of 200.
Hmm. That's amazing.
Um,
Well,
so
yeah, you've sold the advantages of the pack raft. You said it's life changing. How did it change your life?
yeah, so the if we kind of like get into the story of my transition from being a primarily kayaker to primarily pack rafter. I will say I still kayak. I've got several hard shells, but the days I spend in each boat are outnumbered by the inflatables now. And after getting kind of pack raft curious down in Durango, I got to do a couple of trips. We did a multi-day on Cataract Canyon on the Colorado, where instead of dealing with paddling the like 70 miles of flat water for the paddle in and paddle out combined, instead we hiked in, put in at the top of all the rapids, ran all the rapids, and then hiked out a really spectacular slot canyon. So had this like cool multi-sport, checks all the boxes, multi-dimensional engagement with the canyon. And I was like, oh, okay, this is cool. This is a new way of traveling. This is a new way of looking at the river, and this could start to open up some new opportunities. And then got curious about Viacedo, and so Jeff and I, people had run it in a pack raft before, but we didn't have them with us, and we didn't like talk. We didn't hear many of their stories. We just knew that at lower flows it might not be a totally outrageous thing to do. I knew where I was in Viacedo Creek. I was familiar with the lines and the progression of rapids, so Jeff and I decided to go in there together, and I was anticipating it going very poorly. I figured that we would be swimming all of the main rapids and just getting pretty munched and getting beaten up a little bit. But I was like, we can, like, it's been done before. We can do it. Let's sort this thing out. And we went in there at like 160 CFS or something. And I'll certainly never forget the experience of running entrance falls. The first real drop on Viacedo is this like 16 to 18 foot waterfall that's a little bit complex. It's got a curler coming off the lip, and it's a little hard to get. It's fast and tricky to get lined up for, and a lot of people mess it up, and a lot of people get beat down, and a lot of people swim out of creek boats in that one. And so I was kind of anticipating having a similar experience. I hadn't really boofed the packraft much to speak of, but we went in and scouted, and kind of Jeff had never run anything close to that difficult before. So I was talking him through what we were going for. And then he hung out on the scout while I went back up to my boat and ran it. And I just like took the strokes that you need to get down to the lip and be in the right position, and lined up and caught a good surge through the V wave, and took the big powerful left stroke off the lip of the drop and just sailed off of it totally flat.
Nice.
Landed with
That's
a
awesome.
big slap at the bottom and skipped across the pool. Head was
Nice.
totally dry, didn't get water on my deck even. And as I was halfway to the landing, still midair, I just thought, holy shit, like this boat's a kayak. And the packrafts were still pretty new to me, but it just did exactly what I wanted it to do. So that really gave me a lot of encouragement, and started thinking like, okay, we can run with this. And over the course of the next couple of years, John Baker started getting into it as well, and he was already a Class 5 kayaker. So Jeff wasn't quite there yet. He got a little beaten down in Vallecito Creek, but came out okay. But it wasn't super eager to return. But John and I definitely were, and so he and I started making a habit of going up there anytime we could. And for folks who don't know, it's still like a 45-minute drive from Durango, and then from there you've got a 2-mile hike to get to the put in. So it's mostly a weekend affair for people, and folks will go up and kind of spend the weekend hanging out and do a lap, maybe do 2 laps. And John and I would be texting each other while we're at work, watching the levels in the spring, and we'd blast up there and paddle it after work. And then we started doing laps after work. There was a night that we did 3 laps after work.
Nice.
We were chasing daylight for sure, but we were also jogging up the trail with our boats back on our shoulders, and just like blitzing down the run, moving as fast as we could, not catching eddies, and just kind of rallying through and having a great time, and really getting tuned in to what the boats are capable of. And as that was happening, I couldn't help but think about some of these missions that are out there that had been on my radar, but seemed so unattainable. And I was writing up a little like journal about it, and was thinking of some of these runs that I had been hearing about in those early days of the Scott Lindgren videos and the No Big Names videos, and the like Upper Cherry, where these guys are carrying their kayaks for 12 miles over mountain passes. And after my Black Canyon experience, I didn't have that much desire to carry a heavy boat that far. But I couldn't help but wonder, like, could this boat handle that sort of terrain? And so I put together this list of all these different rivers that had been on my radar, of rivers that I held in super high esteem, and but thought of them as being off the table, just beyond my level as an athlete. And so I jotted down some of those rivers, and I added Upper Cherry to the list, and I think I added the North Stein to the list, and I added the Middle Kings to the list with a big question mark, and then I added Bull Lake Creek to the list, and then I deleted Bull Lake Creek from the list, and then I added it back on the list, and then I was like, no, I've heard about Bull Lake Creek. There's no way that thing is even too burly for most of the like Middle Kings High Sierra crushers, and so I deleted it from the list again. But then in the summer of 2018, for one reason or another, I was going to be in Wyoming, and Jeff was going to be in Wyoming, and John was going to be kind of close to Wyoming, and we were
Mm.
all going to be like near Wyoming right around the time that Bull Lake Creek is supposed to be good. And
Fate is
so we
giving you
and
something,
so
a
we
hint.
started talking about it, and the it was still by far like the most intimidating run I had ever considered at that point in my paddling career. But the the piece of it that gave me the most comfort and confidence in the idea that it wasn't totally foolhardy for us to go in there was how light our boats were. Was this notion that, okay, sure, here's this run that has a 20-plus-mile hike in, that many groups take 2 days just to get to the put in, and then is peppered with class 5 plus whitewater all the way to the takeout with monstrous portages. If we get in there and we decide that it is just way over our heads, we can just bail. We can quit anytime. We can turn this into a backpacking trip with an extra like 18 pounds of unnecessary equipment with us. So we decided that the only way to figure out if the boat was capable of running something as ambitious as Bull Lake Creek was to just go do it.
Mm.
And as we started cooking up our there are different ways to get into Bull Lake Creek. There are several different access points. It's not nearly as straightforward as like the Middle Kings or Upper Cherry. And so we were looking at all these different access options, and then Jeff, being the backcountry connoisseur that he is, threw out this suggestion to us where, instead of going in and hiking this well established trail that is what everybody else has always done, um, we could instead go from the other side. And Bull Lake Creek flows off the flows off the east side of the winds, and so we could instead approach it from the west side of the
Mm.
winds. And instead of having a 20-mile hike, we could have a 28-mile hike. And instead of gaining 3,000 feet of elevation, we could gain 6,000 feet of elevation, or whatever it is. I mean, the statistics definitely weren't in our favor, but that wasn't the point, because what we were setting ourselves up for was this really rich landscape traverse. And we hiked in to a place called Titcomb Basin, which is one of the most like well-known, spectacular hiking, backpacking destinations in the country. And
Mm.
we hiked in to get into that basin on the west side. We had set this big shuttle, and then we hiked up and over a pass on the Continental Divide going off trail, and and we did this, we kind of studied the maps to get a sense of how the upper Bull Lake Creek watershed, uh, how it all mapped out. And one thing that the winds are really well known for is glaciers. The Wind River Range has something like 7 of the 10 largest glaciers in the lower 48, or something like that.
Mm.
It's a glaciated range, but it also has a lot of active glaciers still. And so, and those are part of the headwaters of Bull Lake Creek. And so we ended up climbing up this pass at the head of Titcomb Basin, and then as we crested the pass, we stepped onto the very upper head of Helen Glacier. And from there, we were truly in the absolute purest headwaters of Bull Lake Creek. And
Mm.
so we walked down this glacier to the toe of the glacier where the snowmelt was coming out the bottom of it. And then we just followed the water course down, walked down the valley through this little
Mm.
glacial stream with wildflowers poking up all over the place, kind of
Wow.
enjoying our hike, because
Yeah.
our pack weight was like 55 pounds, and
Wow.
it was all well balanced in backpacks. Um, we each had a one-piece paddle in our hand, and our kayaking helmets served as mountaineering helmets too. And we just walked on down this valley, and basically until there was enough water to paddle. and then we inflated our boats, and so the first 10 miles or so that we paddled would have been first descent, and we got down to some of the lakes, and made our way down. Eventually, made our way to the classic put in on, I think it would have been day 3 of our trip. And
Nice.
so similarly, we spent about 2 days getting in, and we just made it
Yeah.
a different route.
But you had a backpacking trip out of it that most people will go just for that. And now you have a bonus whitewater run.
Yeah, and it proved to be a really interesting, rich experience of entering the river from the true headwaters, and cruising down from where it really starts. And that's not an experience that you get very readily with kayaking expeditions. And so then now we're at the put-in for what is described in Whitewater of the Southern Rockies as the hardest run in this guidebook. And we've got these dinky little incapable boats. But we pushed off, and we just were taking things slow, and scouting rapids, scouting pretty much everything, but feeling a lot of confidence in the lines, and we boogied our way down, and we found ourselves running pretty much everything. And we got to this classic 20-foot waterfall that's on the cover of the guidebook, and we all took a shot at that. And for the most part, that it wasn't very stylish, but we all made it out okay. And
that's awesome.
And kept cruising down. We got to the big drop on the run called Hagendasen, and that was kind of an interesting moment where that drop has a really challenging lead in, and I'm super impressed with that anybody has been able to make a clean line out of it. And when I've watched videos of people greasing the lead in, that's definitely super next level paddling skill and strength. But what a lot of people do after the lead in, it goes into this sliding 40-footer or something, and the first bit of it is a slide, and then it goes into free fall and plunges into this big pool. And so what a lot of people will do is they'll get in their boats at the top of that slide section, and then you can seal launch in and generally skate across to the main slide and get all the shits and giggles of the free fall without all the trepidation of the scary move at the top.
Right.
And so there was this part of me that really wanted to fire up that seal launch in and slide down. And the other guys had no interest. They it hadn't even occurred to them that somebody in the group might be thinking about Haagen-Dazs, but nobody had ever run and dropped that tall in a pack raft before. But I felt like we had something to prove as pack rafters. And I felt like there was this opportunity to prove something, and I thought it would just be so badass to get a photo of me mid 40-footer sending it in a pack raft, and the other guys just immediately portaged to the bottom and were kind of surprised that I was even looking at it. And eventually, after looking at it a bit more closely, we recognized that one of the deficiencies, shortcomings of pack rafts compared to kayaks is that they really don't do well on slides. So I mentioned that they do well with shallow boulders, but they do very poorly with slides. So we
they don't
recognized
they don't track properly, or
they get stuck.
Really?
Yeah, there's too much friction, and the boat kind of warps and to match the shape of the slide itself, and then just slows down a bunch rather than skipping across things the way that a hard shell does, which as obnoxious as that can be at times, it can also be really advantageous with seal launches in some cases. We did a trip in the Sierras where it would have been real hard to get back in the water after this portage in a kayak, but in the pack rafts we were able to set the pack rafts down on a slab of granite that was sloping at probably a 45-degree angle, and climb into our boats with the boat still stuck on that slab,
Wow.
get our thigh straps on, get our spray skirts on, get totally ready to go, and then like scoot off and slide down into the water. So that was just kind of a novel thing, and probably something we wouldn't have been able to do in a hard shell. Anyway, so going back to Haagen-Dazsen though, we eventually concluded that what probably would happen in the pack raft is, instead of me like sliding down this seal launch and then scooting across the slide to get into the main curtain of water and plopping down and plugging into this hole, which really is realistically like the best situation probably would have been me plugging the drop and swimming at the bottom with how inconsistent rolls are after big impacts like that and in aerated water. But the more likely scenario would have been that I would have just like gotten spun out along the side and then fallen off the edge of this thing like 30 feet into green water. So decided that the rationales for why I thought it might be worthwhile to try to send Haagen-Dazsen really wasn't worth it. So we decided to portage that, and then we cruised down and we walked a bunch. The next main crux of Bull Lake Creek is something called Forked Tongue Gorge, and we scouted that for a little while, but it was late in the day, and we decided that we'd be better off just calling it an afternoon. And so it was like we didn't want to drop into that committing gorge at 4:30 p.m. So we decided to just have an early night at camp, and we portaged that gorge wholesale, got back down to the creek right at the bottom of it and set up camp. In the morning, we got up, and there were right off the bat, there was a drop that one of the guys in the group had scouted and come back saying like, yeah, there's this nasty drop that has an undercut cave. It looks like it might go, but it's probably a portage. And so we, in the morning, walked down and started portaging that. And then John Baker and I were looking at it a little more closely, and we're like, I think we can do this. I think this goes. So we, and I think some of the write-ups had talked about that being a portage as well, but we decided that we could set reasonable safety for the undercut. And so John and I both fired that thing up, and it went really well. We had a good time, had clean lines, did what we wanted to do, and we all regrouped down below and got back in our boats and pushed off and paddled another 30 yards downstream or something to this next big horizon line. And that one we scouted for a while, but it had this it was this two-tiered slide with kind of a big pour over, then a little piece in the middle before it fell off this big uneven slide into a big powerful hole at the bottom. And below that, we could see the river for a little ways, but we knew that somewhere pretty shortly downstream was the beginning of the infamous Jim Bridger portage that is supposed to be a long portage that puts the Black Canyon portage to shame. So we were really nervous about what was downstream, and we just were especially cautious, wanting to make sure that nothing was going to that we wouldn't end up with like a runaway swimmer or boat going into that portage. So we decided to portage that one as well. But then as John and I kept looking at each other and kept seeing the line, and as we're like 2/3 of the way done with the portage, we're just looking at each other. We're not saying anything, and my cheeks just start to curl up as I get a little bit of a smile, and John just starts laughing and clapping, and he's like, "Yeah, buddy, atta boy, go get it." So I carried my boat back up, and they all got set up with safety downstream, and went down and ran this thing, and just one of the coolest, funnest rapids I've ever run. Certainly one of the coolest ones I'd run up to that point. And just this like fast lead into a pretty straightforward auto boof, lining you up for this big broken up slide, and just shot right down and punched through the hole at the bottom and popped right into the eddy, and it was all like high fives and smiles. So
That's
after that,
awesome.
John decided he needed some too and went up and ran it as well. And
Nice.
so we were like, this run that we had been worried about us having to hike out of was suddenly turning into something where we were like not just progressing down the canyon and managing the canyon, but we were running the real goods in there. We were running legitimate whitewater. And we got down to this Bridger Portage. I don't really have much memory of it. We just kind of knocked it out, just carried our boats across the talus slope for a little while until the river looked good for us to put on again and keep paddling. A little ways further down, we the last big portage on Bull Lake Creek is this feature called Bull Lake Falls, and it's just a like 400-foot tall boulder pile. But at the bottom of it, the where the river connects to bedrock again, there's this beautiful like 20-foot waterfall that it sounds like a lot of people in the first 5 or 10 groups that ran Bull Lake Creek, people weren't really running that very often. It had been run, but most people were walking around it, and I think largely because people are just gassed by that point from all the effort to get to that spot. But we still felt like we had quite a bit of energy, and John's the only one who fired it up, but he did. And at that point, like part of his reasoning for it is he just wanted to like see what these boats could do. That's what we're in here doing, and we hadn't run a waterfall like that before, so he wanted to give it a shot and see what it would look like, and he just greased it. Peeled out of the eddy, got right to where he needed to be, cruised over the little domer, took a late stroke, got his bow up just enough that he punched the hole at the bottom and shot right out of there. Looked great. So Bull Lake Creek kind of went off by and large without a hitch, and felt to me like that was really the one that just opened up the gates of okay.
And not only that, right? But this wasn't like going in at ultra low flows. This was a totally legitimate flow for the run.
Yes, absolutely. A lot of the trips we've done, we've kind of ended up with lower flows, but I think I'm sure people are going in quite a bit higher now, but the guidebook has a recommended flow range of like 400 to 500 CFS, and we were in there with like upper 400s, like 490 on the gauge or something like that. So and that was another piece of it. Like those were the dates that we had set aside for availability, but we weren't very excited about the flow when we were going in there. We were intimidated. We were like, shit, man. Like it not only is this a very challenging, difficult expedition, but we're going in at high water evidently. And I'm glad that we did. It was a great level. Like I said, the Forked Tongue Gorge was pretty powerful, and decided we just didn't want any part of that. But everything up above was plenty good, and yeah, we were running powerful whitewater, especially towards the bottom. And I did a little blog write up of that, and that was probably in August, and so I had put up some photos and a write up of the story on a blog, and a couple weeks prior to that, I had run into Ben Stooksbury again up at the North Fork, and I actually bought a kayak off of him, and so he and I were already kind of in touch. But then, like a couple weeks after our Bull Lake Creek trip, I get a call from him, wondering what it's all about, and pick up the phone, and he was just like, "Hey Dan, I just read your. I'm looking into doing Bull Lake Creek this next year, and I was looking up some beta on it, and I saw your blog post. Like, holy shit, man! You guys just did Bull Lake. That's incredible." He was really curious about the route, because that's totally up his
Yeah.
alley. And so that next year, he ended up he and Boomer and Owen Doyle, and I think Noria might have been on that trip. I can't remember, but they did something very similar, going in from the same trailhead, and
Hmm.
they based on some suggestions that I made, they chose a slightly different route and paddled a different tributary,
Hmm.
but still like did the same sort of general thing of over the Continental Divide and go in from the tippy top.
Super cool.
But part of that conversation, as we were talking about how much of the whitewater we had been able to run, he was like, "Gosh, if you guys were able to really paddle that much of of Bull Lake, it seems like you guys should go run Middle Kings."
Hmm.
To which my response was, "Well, funny you should say that, because that is very much the next thing on our list."
Nice.
And more than anything, it was really gratifying to get that like vote of confidence from someone
Hmm.
like Ben,
Yeah.
because we still very much felt like kind of the bastard children of the kayaking world. And to the extent where like I wasn't, before we ran Bull Lake, I didn't tell anyone we were going in there because I didn't want anyone to have expectations of us coming out with any level of success.
Yeah.
We were just kind of like keeping that stuff to ourselves and keeping the cards close to our chest. But when
Hmm.
when the trip went so well, we were like, okay, this is actually legit.
Hmm.
We can claim this. It's okay for us to tell people what we're doing out here.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Let's pause for a second. Right at
Sounds
the
good.
2 hour and 3 minute mark, to check in, because here I go like droning on and on and on a little too much. Yeah, so after Bull Lake was behind us, we had our sights set on the Middle Kings, and after finishing Bull Lake, we had a little bit of, I mean, we had a big sense of pride and accomplishment of having pulled off this mission, but we also were taking it with a little bit of a grain of salt, just thinking about how difficult the level of whitewater really was in there. And we kind of had the takeaway that when we portaged Fork Tongue Gorge and we portaged a couple other like really steep, nasty sections, that the whitewater in Bull Lake is not super difficult. I wouldn't call it class 5 plus. And the I think that a big part of where that notion of this is the hardest run in the guidebook comes from is more a testament to just how challenging the expedition is, of
Hmm.
getting all the way in there and then handling all of the portages and the level of effort that has to go into pulling that off.
Yeah.
And so we weren't coming away from that like thumping our chests saying, yeah, we're invincible, we can go run anything now in these boats. And so as we were thinking about the Middle Kings, we were looking at that with a similar level of trepidation. We having this sense that the Middle Kings is actually much more difficult whitewater than what we had experienced in the past. So we wanted to make sure that we were really tuned up for it. And we did a couple of things. I mean, one is that we all paddled as much as we could and got as much more familiarity with these boats as we could. And one piece that's important to mention in here is that the boats we paddled on Bull Lake and the boats that we were ready to take to the Middle Kings were still that middle generation of packraft. So they were the alpacalypses. They did not have the displacement hull of the Valkyrie. They still had thigh straps and internal storage and decks and everything like that, but they had this major flaw, I guess, in whitewater performance, where the bottom of the boat was totally flat side to side. They were a planing
Hmm.
hull rather than having any kind of displacement hull, and that was just a product of what they had of the construction techniques that the boat designers were using up to that point. And so that design was really popular for novice level paddlers just getting into boating, because you can get in that boat and it's really stable and you can comfortably paddle class 2 and class 3 whitewater, and
Sure.
by and large not need a whole lot of like balance, intuition, and eddy catching skills to be able to stay upright. But they were really problematic when trying to run harder whitewater, and a real deficiency for experienced kayakers, because it meant that it was hard to get up on edge, and when you would get up on edge they weren't very stable. So um, after we came away from Bull Lake, part of the thing is that we also were like, we were really fired up on the potential of these boats as legitimate whitewater craft, and we started like poking and prodding the folks at Alpaca uh, to work on incorporating a couple different design changes that we had in mind, mainly working towards a displacement hull and making the boats narrower overall to make them less stable, but also more stable on edge, effectively more like a kayak.
Right.
So we had planted those seeds, and some of that work was getting underway, but it wasn't done by the time that we were queued up to run the Middle Kings. So we were
Hmm.
going to end up going back into the Middle Kings with these older this boat that we weren't totally stoked on. I guess we knew that it had some room for improvement, but it was the best thing that we had, and we wanted to go check it out. The Middle Kings is most notorious, I'd say, for the last bit of the river. They call it the bottom 9. The last 9 miles has a ton of gradient and a different character of whitewater, a lot less bedrock and a lot more boulders, and so just generally less clean, a lot of sieves, complex rapids. And anytime we had seen videos or reports of people running the Middle Kings, and friends that we had talked to were like, oh yeah, the Middle Kings, like it's an awesome river, it's spectacular, but boy, you get to the bottom 9 and it gets real. And so we were super intimidated by that section in particular. Um, these boats that had the flat bottom, they would do really well on super manky stuff. They would, like I said, they weren't great on slides, but they were acceptable. And they just wouldn't have a ton of control. But all the stuff on the upper reaches of the Middle Kings seemed like we were like, yeah, that stuff will all be totally fine. We can figure that stuff out. It's the bottom 9 where we start getting into like deep seams and laterals and like big water moves, sort of, that we're a lot more concerned about how these boats might work and flip us over and stuff us into sieves and things like that. And so we went in there with a lot of trepidation and caution. And one of the things we did logistics wise to set ourselves up with that is we wanted to maintain that option of bailing if we decided the river was just too intense, just like we did in Bull Lake. And so most people run the Middle Kings by hiking in from the South Lake trailhead outside of Bishop on the east side of the Sierras. They cross the Sierra Divide at Bishop Pass, and then they hike, and then there's this long descent to get down to the Kings, and then they float down from there. We chose to do something a little different. We had heard that the first 5 miles are pretty manky and we wouldn't be missing out on anything. And then B, we wanted to have a vehicle available to us at kind of a midpoint. So there is a trail that from the Rancheria trailhead that drops into the Middle Kings right at Tehipite Valley, which is where the river kind of mellows out right before it goes into the bottom 9. So there is actually a well-developed system trail along the river the entire length except for that bottom 9 miles. So instead of us hiking in from the top, we hiked in from the bottom, and did so in a way that we gave ourselves a good bailout option if we needed to. It also made the shuttle overall quite a bit shorter. It made the hike quite a bit longer. Our hike took us 2 days to get down to Tehipite, and then another full day of hiking up the river trail. But a cool part of that is that as we were hiking up the river trail, we got to see everything that was there. And as we hiked up, we were looking at it and we just thought, yep, this looks like what we came here for. This looks good. This looks good. And to just kind of cut to the chase, so the Middle Kings wasn't really that eventful of a trip. We had a great time. We were surprised at how much of the stuff up above we ran. We got down to the bottom 9. We had left a little bit of a cache of some of our food for the last part of the trip. So we also had lighter boats up
Nice.
top by
Yeah, that's
leaving some
cool.
of our stuff at that midway point, and then we decided to go for it in the bottom 9. And
Nice.
one of the 4 people in the group was feeling pretty intimidated, and he did hike out to the car. So it was a good thing that we had left ourselves that option. But then Jeff, John, and I still pushed on down, and we had slightly lower water than most groups are going in there with in hard shells. We had slightly less than 1,000 CFS, and that helped us out a lot by breaking things up. And the bottom 9, any way you slice it, there's a lot of portaging in there. Even the big name kayakers, for the most part, are going in and portaging like 6 to 10 times in that section of river, and our portage count was right in that range.
Hmm.
Um,
Nice.
I don't think there was really anything that we walked around where I thought, if only I had my creek boat here, I'd be able to fire this up. But I
Really?
don't. I just have this stupid ducky, so I'm gonna put it on my shoulder and walk around. And one of the things that was really gratifying was that because our boats were so light, it made the decision to portage stuff much easier. What
Yeah.
might have happened if I had a my creek boat fully loaded weighing 80 pounds and I was exhausted at that point in the trip, what I might have done is said, I really don't want to run this rapid, but I feel too exhausted to portage. So I think my better option is to just go ahead and run it. And we were spared of that kind of decision making. We were able to
Hmm.
just say, no, this looks gross. It doesn't look quality. I'm just going to throw my boat on my shoulder real quickly, and I'm going to jump from rock to rock and be back in the water full of energy in 40 seconds.
Yeah,
So
that's
the
huge.
the way that we were able to pick apart the bottom 9 felt way safer having our pack rafts than it did than I think it would have being in there in kayaks, unless you're in really exceptional physical shape to have that kind of endurance. Um, so we picked that off. We made our way through the bottom 9, and paddled out the Garlic Falls section. I broke a paddle and swam on Garlic Falls. That was probably where we
Ooh.
had ended up having the most carnage. But
Yeah.
other groups have had similar experiences of celebrating a little too early when they get to the confluence coming out of the middle.
but
Um,
the swim was easy because you had a pack raft, right?
the swim was pretty easy with the pack raft, and portaged a couple things in Garlic Falls as well. But and we were also gassed by the time we got down there. We were still pretty exhausted, just much less exhausted than I think I would have been in if I had been shouldering a creek boat through so much of
How,
that stuff.
how many days on the river did you end up taking?
I think we did 4 days on the river. So we
Okay.
did 2 days of hiking, and then let's see, yeah, we didn't hike all the way up to the Palisade Creek spot. We hiked basically to the bottom of a kind of nasty rapid called Squeeze Play. We put in right below that, and then the first day, I think we paddled all the way down to Simpson Meadow, and then the next day we worked our way down to uh, through the middle 4 and got down to Tehipite. And then, yeah, we had day 3. We paddled most of the bottom 9, but weren't quite able to make it to the confluence. And then in the morning, we got up and finished off the middle and out Garlic Falls. So 4
Nice.
days on the water.
Yeah.
And one of the fun things about us doing these trips as pack rafters is also going back to that like notion of showing yourself down the river for the first time. Every one of these trips we do, we're going down without anyone who's seen it before. So that's
Yeah.
just
That's
continues to
awesome.
be a special piece of the way that we engage with the river and the relationship that we develop with it in figuring it out for ourselves. And paying such close attention to the character of the river throughout. So uh, Middle Kings went great. We were stoked after that. We were really enamored with the Sierra. The next couple of years was when the first edition of the Alpaca Valkyrie came out. And so we started paddling. We did several more trips to the High Sierra. We did some trips around the southwest Colorado area. Another trip up into the, like you mentioned, that headwaters of Ayacito trip. We did a repeat of that. Um, we did a repeat of the Middle Kings the following year. Jeff and I did. Our friend Alan joined us for the first half of it, and then he got injured and also had to hike out that same spot at Tehipity. But Jeff and I did another trip through the bottom nine, and we did some other that year. We did some other exploratory paddling in the High Sierra. Did a trip into Upper Cherry. Then the next year, John was back with us, and we did a few more rounds in the Sierra, some more exploratory paddling, some things that I'm not sure if anyone had done before, but certainly some things that are very obscure and beyond the list of like the Seven Rivers expedition.
Yeah.
Things that folks haven't heard of, and things that we didn't have a whole lot of beta on, or no beta. And one of the things that kind of going back to that deficiency of the planing hull boats, well, now that we're into like 2020, 2021, we're using the Valkyrie. That was when Alpaca finally figured out how to get a displacement hull going. And so we had edgeability side to side. And where that made the biggest difference for me, I mean, it certainly had the impact of greater confidence in our rolls, but where it really had the biggest impact for me was confidence in going through funky water, where you just have like you might have to like melt into a lateral a little bit and just throw a little low brace. That idea of the little like, yeah, you're just gonna like drop in there kind of sideways, give a little low brace, and it'll shoot you right out. That sort of move that is really commonplace and we don't think twice about in a kayak is not something that you're confident with in the older version of packrafts. But with these displacement holes, it did open that up. And as an example, like Upper Cherry being mostly a pretty low volume slide and plop and drop kind of run, that was the style of run that felt totally reasonable in the older boats. But the Cherry Creek section of the Tuolumne River, the dam release Class 5 Boulder Garden run downstream, that many more people run pretty regularly, that felt a lot more intimidating because that has more of that kind of character of like, yeah, you're going to like get up onto this lateral and you've got these powerful kind of deep water stroke maneuvers that you have to make. And so that sort of run felt a lot more intimidating. But we went back to the High Sierra, a couple years in a row after that Middle King trip, and kept exploring new stuff and finding things on maps and having a great time checking out new stuff. But we wanted to dabble a little bit more with paddling more powerful whitewater. And so that's where we turned our attention in 2022. And we decided to take a break that year from the Sierra and head up to the North Cascades. And there were several objectives that we had lined out for us in the North Cascades. Part of our program is that we don't tend to say to have the liberty to pick an objective and say this is what we're going to try to paddle, because we all have too much other things going on with our lives to be able to just drop everything on a whim. And when the flow window aligns, like, all right, this is when I'm taking off. We've got to figure out, the time off from work. We got to figure out things with our families, with our pets, with our kids, whatever it is. And so when we went up to Washington, part of the appeal to that was that we looked at the Sierra and we were like, well, we don't have too many things left on our list there, but the North Cascades is pretty wide open. So we can pick a date 4 months out and we can just say we're going to rendezvous up there. We've got 6 different ideas of missions that we're going to go for depending on what the flows are doing. And we're going to make a game time decision of which of those we're going to go after. Right. And that approach has worked remarkably well for us over the many years that we've been doing this. And this was a perfect example of just how well the timing could not have worked out better with how the flows and the weather generating those flows played out. Nice. So we got up there and there were lots of ideas of rivers we were interested in checking out, but the very top of the list was Bridge Creek, which now is a pretty well-established expedition that people do. That's a very much a well-known kayaking thing. It was a well-known run when we did it. I had actually, this was one time that I cheated the rest of the team in us being able to do something that no one had done before, or no one in the group had done before, because I had run Bridge Creek before in a kayak. I think that I did the second descent of it.
Really?
It's what I was told by the guy that dragged me along on the trip. So I had some understanding of what we were getting ourselves into and what to expect. And we had another addition to our team, who's this guy, Will Blum, who now is a pretty consistent part of our group when we go out on trips. And so this was the first trip that the 4 of us did together. And we rendezvoused up there. We were driving into the put-in, and I was going to pick John up from his family and bring him to the put-in with me. And there was some kind of issue that he had to attend to, and so there was a little bit of uncertainty as to whether or not he was going to even be able to join us on the trip. But what was for sure once I arrived was that he wasn't going to be able to jump in the car with me and join us from the beginning with that trip. But the way that the Bridge Creek trip works, it's a tributary to a river called the Stehekin. This is in North Cascades National Park. And then the Stehekin is a river that flows into the upper end of Lake Chelan, which is one of the deepest lakes in the country. And it's like over 1,000 feet deep, this big glacial lake coming out of the North Cascades. And so you hike in. It's a maybe 6-mile downhill hike on the Pacific Crest Trail, and then you get to Bridge Creek and you cruise on down. And we got in and started, just Jeff and Will and I, we hiked down pretty late in the day and got to the confluence, camped out, and then got up early and put on, which isn't really very good timing because it means that we were at the lowest flow of the day. So the first bit of the run was really low. We were right there just below kind of the minimum kayak cutoff. It was right around 2,000 on the gauge, for reference of anyone who's been in there before. And so that meant that Bridge Creek was just bony. It was shallow, it was rocky. We were dragging a little bit and scraped down, and at those low flows, you just kind of work your way down and scrape down the first 6 miles or so to where a substantial confluence comes in. But more importantly, the river gorges up right there. So after the North Fork of Bridge Creek comes in, the river goes into a gorge, the gradient picks up, and since it's constricted, you get away from the boulder garden, or from the cobble bars, and into boulder gardens and bedrock ledges. And the trail also departs from the river corridor and kind of goes up over the around the gorge, and then eventually drops back down. So we got there and started cruising down, and the only real beta I remembered was that at some point there's a real nasty portage, a nasty sieve that you walk around, that on our second descent trip we had to do quite a bit of rope work to get boats around. And so we were scouting pretty aggressively. There had also been there's always the unknown wood situation up in the Pacific Northwest. So we were scouting pretty aggressively, and spent a lot of time out of our boats making sure that things were clean. But for the most part, we were in a program of just one person scout and give verbal beta, and we kind of picked our way down and made our way to this portage, and we got to the brink of the portage, and we're all able to scramble out of our boats. And I, of course, being the guy who had been down there before and knew what was going on, I was talking up all the rope work that we were going to do, and talking about how we were going to, like, oh, okay, we need to get someone up there, and then we'll pass boats to there, and then there's probably a staging point. Let's start scouting it all out. And Jeff just kind of looks at me and deadpan is like, it looks like I can just carry it. And sure enough, there's like one pretty exposed, dicey step that you have to walk up. But I think when we had been there in the past, the idea of carrying a 70-pound, 80-pound creek boat up that step was a pretty hard pass. And then there's this like little tiptoey traverse along a ledge where you're exposed right above this sieve. So that's why we had done rope work in the past. But with our packrafts, we just put the boats on our shoulder and did our thing. Just walked it out, and portage was done in 2 minutes. Back in the water, cruising downstream, and and at that point, with that extra water and the gorged up nature, we were no longer dealing with bony flow. It was totally prime water levels, and we were having a good time. We were picking out all the lines and figuring things out, stopping to take pictures here and there. And much to our delight, there were really no wood issues to speak of. On my previous trip down, there had been a big nasty log in one of the coolest rapids on the run, and a long rapid that we had to, again, do considerable rope work to navigate. But that time around, it was all flushed out and totally clear. So we boogied right down through it, and we got to the bridge at the Stehekin confluence, and it was like 3 p.m. or something like that. So and that was where we were camping. So since John wasn't with us, we had made this deal that we knew that we were going to camp there, and the deal was like, John, you can send us an inReach message, we'll get it at camp, but try to like, if you're able to join us, then just like boogie down, catch up to us, and meet us at camp. And part of the beta that I had then given him also was like, hey, just so you know, there's a trail bridge where the North Fork comes in. There's a big confluence there. That's where the gorge starts. You probably shouldn't paddle the gorge by yourself, because there's stuff you need to know about in there. There's rope work you need to do. There's going to be wood. There's sieves. And if you're trying to hustle, like, just don't stress yourself out trying to move fast through that section. Don't risk it as the solo boater. Paddle up until that point, and then just hop on the trail and walk down to camp. Yeah. So we're hanging out at camp and looking at our watch, whatever time it is, 4:00 in the afternoon, and we look at each other, and someone's like, we definitely, that last 3 miles was really good. We definitely have time to do that again. No so way. We decided to just stash all of our camping gear in the bear boxes at the nice national park campground that's up there, and threw our boats in our backpacks, and just hoofed it up the trail, knocked out that 3-mile hike in 45 minutes, and we were right back at the bridge, inflating our boats, getting ready for another round.
Another game changer there, huh?
Yeah. And then part of it also was like, hey, John is going to portage. If John catches us, then he's going to get out at that bridge and be portaging, so we could intercept him on the trail, and we could, it would be a bummer for him to not get to run that, so we could intercept him on the trail, and then we can all just do a speed lap through there and just cruise right through. So we throw our boats and our PFDs and our dry tops in our backpacks, and we knock out this 3 miles on the trail. We get up to the bridge, we start inflating our boats, and it's like 6:30 p.m. or something like that by this point. I don't know, whatever time it is. My math isn't adding up here, but we're at a point where we're like, we don't want to be chasing daylight running through this gorge. We also want to make sure that if John is showing up, he that we're here and he gets to join us. And we talk through some of the different options and set a time, like a time criteria, a cutoff for ourselves, and we end up getting to that cutoff, and John's not there, so we just top our boats off, get them pressurized, and push off. And Jeff and Will and I we remember all the lines. We just ran a lap on it, and so we just get a second lap on the best part of the whole run that evening, and get down to and kind of look over our shoulder as we're disappearing around the corner, and no John. But we boogie on down, and we stop at a couple of the bigger quality bedrock drops further down and run a few extra laps on those, and then get down to the logical campsite and hike back up, or logical takeout, and then carry our boats up to our campsite for the night. And when we get to our camp, sure enough, there's John Baker. We had probably missed him by like 3 minutes.
No way.
Such a drag for him that he had to paddle all of the Mank to get down there, and then ended up having to and then carried his boat around the whole gorge. I need to pause for a second again.
Yeah, no problem.
And just a quick minute, I'm going to bring the dog in.
Okay.
Okay. So the rest of our trip on Bridge Creek was very peculiar from a logistics perspective. So now all 4 of us are together. We're ready to go. In the morning, we get up and we paddle downstream from camp. And the way that the Bridge Creek scene works out is you get to the Stehekin and you go downstream a little ways, and then the river goes into a gorge called Tumwater Canyon. And on my previous trip, we had portaged Tumwater Canyon wholesale. The understanding was that it was just too intense. It's a pretty real gorge in there with some really intimidating big rapids, full on class 5. And I don't think anyone had run it. I don't think anyone had run it on the first descent, and so we were just kind of going off of that beta. But the water was lower on this trip, so we were really curious about checking it out. And we got down, and we were interested in checking that out, but we were also interested in checking out this tributary that comes in just below that gorge called Agnes Creek. And so I can't remember exactly what our plan was for the day, but what we ended up doing that was pretty strange is we paddled down, we got to the top of Tumwater Canyon, and then we decided that we wanted to do a pretty thorough scout. So we got out of our boats, we geared down, and then we walked around up on the rim of the canyon, scouting out the gorge for a couple hours. And then we decided that we also wanted that while we were out of our boats and just walking around in hiking clothes, we might as well also take the time to go and scout this other canyon, this other gorge. So we hiked up Agnes, and that is a super committing gorge, really hard for us to get good eyes on every bit of river, and it looked pretty inescapable. So we just wanted to make sure that there weren't any absolute no-go strainers or sieves in there, and we were pretty determined before we dropped in to get a complete enough scout that for the entire section of the gorge, we either could see that the river was runnable, or we could slash portageable at river level, or we could verify that there was an egress from the gorge and a gully
Mm-hmm.
that we could get up. So we ended up spending most of that afternoon scouting the Tumwater Canyon and scouting Agnes Gorge. And by the time we got to, by the end of our scout session, it was probably like 2, maybe 3 in the afternoon. And we were thinking, well, we could get in our boats and start chipping away at some of these. It was actually probably later. It was probably more like 4. But it felt like it was maybe a little late in the day to drop into Tumwater Gorge.
Mm-hmm.
But what we did have time for was another lap on Bridge Creek. So we carried our boats back up to the campsite that we had been at, and we had left all our camping gear there anyway. We were planning on camping there multiple nights. So we carried our empty boats back up there in our backpacks, and then walked right past camp, 3 miles back up the trail, got to that confluence at the top of the North Fork, and then because we wanted to make sure John got a chance to paddle bridge, so we just did a little hasty lap of ripping down that, chasing daylight again, and got a third evening lap down Bridge Creek, and got down to our campsite. So at that point, we're now camping for another night, and we haven't run much of the Tumwater Canyon. We ran some of the lead-in rapids, but we have gotten a pretty thorough scout, and we're ready to go for it in the morning. And so in the morning, we get up, we paddle down, we run a handful of rapids that we're familiar with now on the lead-in, and then we get into the gorge and we start chipping away at some of these big complex boulder gardens in the gorge. And we get down about 2/3 of the way through, and in one of the drops, one of the paddlers is running this little drop close to the wall on the far side of the river from our scout, and ends up just getting stuffed in the hole a bit, kind of spun around, and swims out of his boat. And it's not a terrible violent swim, but he is all the way on the other side of the river from our scout, and a couple of us are still out of our boats, and it is also right above another really big rapid. So that was kind of a tense moment. I ended up throwing a throw bag to him, but it took me a while. I didn't have my throw bag with me while I was scouting and taking photos, and so that was a big mistake on my part. And then there was also some uncertainty on whether he even wanted a throw bag, because he had his paddle and was with his boat, but was just in like a spot where it was hard to climb back in and paddle to shore, which mostly we do the self-rescue thing in that scenario. So we just kind of had this tense moment of some wires crossed right above an exposed spot. And so after the rest of us had run that rapid and we all regrouped, eddied out, and started scouting the next one, the fire was pretty muted at that point, and we were the next rapid looked really challenging to really stick the line on it, and as it went around the corner, it looked like it was pooling up, but there was also some wood that we couldn't really get a clear sense of what the wood situation was. We hadn't gotten a good view of this rapid from the scout. What we had gotten was we had looked at it and seen okay, we can see this rapid from shore, so we'll deal with it once we're down at river level. And then once we're down at river level, we started to come to the conclusion that we just couldn't deal with this rapid, and it wasn't portageable. So of all the different options that we were mulling around, what we decided to do was get out of the gorge there. And there was I think somebody was fired up to run it, but not everybody was, and so we made that decision that as a team, we couldn't set safety on this rapid, so the real prudent thing to do was for us to climb out of the gorge. And there was a route. It was not easy, but we did see a bunch of shavings of plastic as we were climbing up from other kayakers who had made the same decision. And we were certainly glad that we didn't have the kayaks that we had to yard out of there with haul systems. So we made our way up to the rim, and this is where things got particularly bizarre from a logistics standpoint. We had the option of either we could um, portage this rapid, find another route down to the canyon, and then down into the gorge the and run the last like 4 rapids of this canyon, or we could say we've mostly ticked this off. Let's go check out Agnes Creek. So that's what we did. We went and rallied up to Agnes and um, spent an hour hiking the trail up to the top of that, and then spent a few hours working our way down through that creek. And then once we were done paddling Agnes Creek, it was still only 3 or 4 in the afternoon. We had plenty of daylight left, so we did not decide to do a third or a fourth lap on Bridge Creek. But we did go back to the Stehekin, hike down into the canyon downstream of the rapid that we had portaged, that we had hiked out at, and dropped back into the canyon and paddled the rest of the rapids down below it. So
cool.
We paddled both of those sections. We just did them a little bit out of sequence, but it made a lot of sense logistically for us at the time. And then again, we were planning on camping yet another night back up at the Bridge Creek campsite. So we headed back up there and hiked. We were able to have empty boats for this whole session of paddling all this stuff in that zone. And we hiked back up to our campsite for the night and had dinner and went to bed. And then the icing on the cake of this trip is that the way that most people do Bridge Creek, virtually everybody does it this way. You hike down to Bridge Creek, you paddle Bridge, you paddle the Stehekin, you paddle that. From the bottom of Tumwater Canyon, you paddle another 15 miles of like braided class 2, and you get down to the little town of Stehekin and the ferry terminal on Lake Chelan. And then you have to have a reservation to get your boats on the ferry that goes across Lake Chelan, and you pay for that ferry to drive you to the nearest road on the other side of the lake. And it's not a car ferry; it's just a passenger ferry. So they only have capacity for a few kayaks, and so because of that, not a whole lot of, like, if one group is doing Bridge Stehekin one weekend, then another group can't go because there's no space on the ferry for their boats. So you've got to get that reservation. And then from the takeout back up to the put-in is, classic kayak expedition. It's another like 3.5 hour shuttle or something like that to get back to the trailhead where you started. What we did instead is we turned around and we hiked upstream. So we hiked further upstream on the Stehekin, got to a tributary and hiked a trail up that tributary and climbed over one of the passes in the North Cascades. So now we're up above tree line. We're surrounded by high peaks and glaciers, and on a well-built national park trail. And we cruise down that trail back, losing elevation back into old growth Washington forests, and we drop in to the upper headwaters of a watershed called Thunder Creek. And Thunder Creek is a pretty well-known summertime class 5 run in the North Cascades. That's like Washington's little ace in the hole for August and September class 5 kayaking. It's a hike in, again, similar logistics to Vallecito Creek. You hike for an hour and a half, and then put in and paddle a few miles. But we got into Thunder Creek something like 12 miles upstream of where most people typically put in. And in that 12 miles, we weren't running some like plethora of super high quality class 4 or 5 drops. But we were camped out that night at the toe with this, at the toe of a big mountain with views of a spectacular glacier I got another one of those like headwater trip experiences where we got to run the river from the uppermost runnable point and worked our way
Hmm.
down, mostly paddling like a handful of class 4 drops, but mostly meadows and class 2. And eventually that delivered us to the top of Thunder Creek, which I had not run before. So that was a new stretch of river for all of us. And
Nice.
Thunder Creek is just an absolute gem. It starts off with a bang with this big, powerful 18-foot waterfall. And I mentioned that the timing was really perfect, and because Thunder Creek drains some pretty big glaciers, and so it carries a lot of flow, and it really is more of like an August, September kind of run. And the flow window for that just doesn't line up with Bridge Creek. Bridge Creek runs earlier. Bridge is more of a June, early
Mm.
July. But when we got to Bridge Creek, the flow was just at the upper or at the lower end of runnable, and Thunder was way too high. But
Mm.
as we were in Bridge Creek, uh, and those several days that we spent there, we had a cold front come in, temperatures dropped, clouds showed up, shaded the glaciers, and the flows from on Thunder Creek dropped like 30% during the time we were
Yeah,
in there, and dropped
that's
right
convenient.
into the very upper end of the runnable range. So
Hmm.
we were running super low on Bridge and super high on Thunder,
Hmm.
and so Thunder was the real opportunity for us to check out how these boats could do with like big, powerful features,
Yeah.
um, and they did what we needed them to do, and
Hmm.
we the big waterfall. By the time that we got there, I was uh, I was pretty haggard and rattled. I had been bluff charged by a black bear earlier that day in my
Whoa.
boat, so I was still kind of like jittery, shaking from having that experience. Will and John weren't super fired up on it either, and Jeff traditionally had not been what like known as the hard charger of our group, but when we got down to Trial Falls on Thunder Creek, uh, Jeff Jeff was ready for it. Jeff had some fire, and he saw the line, and it was definitely at the upper end of runnable, with a pretty stomp and punishing hole at the bottom of it. But
Hmm.
Jeff was ready to give it a shot, and dropped in and greased the lead in and kept his bow up and got his stroke in, boofed out, and skipped away from the curtain on it. And then
Nice.
from there down, the rest of Thunder Creek is just like pinkies up party boofs for a few miles.
Sweet.
And not
Sounds
without its
amazing.
challenges. There were we portaged a couple things. There's some wood hazards, and there's some pretty heads up boating in there. But we kept it together, and everyone had clean lines, and we got into a good routine of probes going down and scouting and giving beta as needed. And at one point, the last rapid is really pretty challenging to scout, but we kind of split the group up, and I probed down to see if I could get a view at it from river level. Turns out I couldn't, but we weren't all committed to the gorge. We had kind of planned around it, and so um, as we were approaching that rapid, I went down to see it. We could tell that there's this very committed gorge with no eddies before the next horizon line, or no getting out of your boat, I should say. There was an eddy midstream behind a boulder, and I went and got in there and just tried to see if I could pick a line, and I couldn't. So I gave those guys the message, and then Jeff scrambled along the gorge rim through the forest for a little ways, got down to where he could scout the move for me, and gave me the beta, and I went down and caught the next eddy to set up safety for everybody else running down through.
Hmm.
So
So is this, I mean, getting into that kind of bigger, powerful water, is that the kind of thing that would not have been possible in the older iterations of the pack rafts?
100%.
Yeah.
Yeah, that sort of stuff would have been terrifying
Hmm.
in the flat bottom boats.
Hmm.
And part of that confidence to paddle like the more sustained, stacked up, bigger water, complicated hydraulics, part of the confidence with that comes from a better sense that we can roll up when we need to, but a big part of it comes from the sense that we can just keep upright because we have so much more control over our boats.
Hmm. So
And
it's really, really opened up a whole new range of things that you can take these things down.
yeah,
That
and since
it's
then, like I've run the lower 5 on the North Fork with it, and
really.
um, it's not my first choice for a boat on the North Fork. That was more of like answering the
Training
question.
kind of mission.
Yeah, exactly. It was training. It's something that I had kind of uh, suggested there before. My attitude towards packrafts on the North Fork was like, there's no reason to packraft the North Fork. Packrafts have no place there. It's roadside. Like it's a liability to be in an inflatable. You should just paddle your hard shell. But then after some other trips up in British Columbia where we were paddling water of that same kind of character, just deep in the backcountry, I was like, maybe we shouldn't be experimenting with this sort of stuff in a place that's so remote and unknown. Maybe
Yeah.
I should experiment in a place that is familiar where like I know what's going to happen and I know the lines. So it was
Yeah.
illuminating to paddle it on that kind of white water. And yeah, there's a bunch. We've been poking our heads into British Columbia a bit. Paddled some big water on the Kern, the
Hmm.
like the forks of the Kern at high water,
Well,
and they've been super capable of that kind of stuff. So
that's amazing. Never would have thought. But it's I guess you've now kind of expanded like the realm of possibilities, and probably as you're planning your next trips, it's like opened up a whole bunch of different drainages that you might not have considered prior on.
big time, and
Are
open,
there
yeah, and new flows as well.
are there bigger and better Valkyries coming along? Is that are they continue to iterate, and do you think there's room for improvement?
I mean, there's always going to be room for improvement. I think the jump that they made coming from the version 2, the V2, up to the V3 was a meteoric jump in performance. They made the tubes narrower and the rocker got better and everything just got cleaner. Um, and I don't know that there will be another jump of that magnitude ever, but uh, they're the folks at Alpaca Raft are obsessive about design and improvement, and I think that there was a ton of drive to build up the Valkyrie in like from 2020 until 2023. They were coming out with a new version every year, and after the V3 came out, I think they decided to put more of their energy into other
Mm,
boats that are more within like their kind of classic packraft demographic.
yeah, makes sense. Where they're actually going to sell more than to four
Yeah,
people that go running class 5.
yeah. I mean the market of people who are interested in running class 5 whitewater and like and even class. I mean, the Valkyrie is a fun boat to paddle. I have friends who have one and are never going to be class 5 boaters, but still love it for paddling class
Yeah.
4. But it still is 5 pounds heavier, which is 50% heavier
Hmm.
than some of their other boats. And so if folks are
Hmm.
really just interested in doing like a quality wilderness run, like the Middle Fork of the Flathead or something like that, or a Cataract Canyon trip, then
It's
it's
just
not
extra weight.
necessary to have,
Yeah.
yeah, to have all that extra performance. But
Hmm.
man, they sure are fun.
Well, that's cool. That's super interesting to see how it's just completely changes your perspective on how you look at rivers, how you look at approaches, how you even look at like what the tributaries mean or laps, right? Like
Yeah,
opening up, doing Bridge Creek laps just because why not? It's right here. It's easy.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And we tend to look at regions rather than specific rivers. So we're looking at
Mm-hmm.
things thinking not just here's this one river, what's a way that like let's go run that one river, but here's here's a whole system of rivers. How can we connect multiple of them to each other? When we came out on Thunder Creek at the end of that North Cascades trip, the other piece of it is that our shuttle was only 30 minutes to go retrieve the car. So,
which is, yeah, it's like multiple stages in the trip. It takes out a lot of pain points, right? Like,
yeah,
takes out
and
a lot of exhaustion. Yeah.
Even something like a day trip on the Piedra River in southwest Colorado. That's another place where they can make a ton of sense, because the Piedra you put in, and then you get to the end of the whitewater and you've got an hour of class 2 to get to the takeout, and then spend a bunch of time unwinding the shuttle. But if when we go in there with packrafts, we just run the upper half, get to, and then there's a trail that comes down to the river. We hike up that trail for 15 minutes and get to the top, where we've got a bike stashed, and then it's a downhill bike shuttle to go retrieve the car, and we can easily do 3 Piedra laps in a day.
It's clearly opened up kind of like a lot of exploratory opportunities for you. Do you find yourself ever in like some really good sections of whitewater where you're like, this would be a lot more fun if I had a hard shell? Or is it substantially performant enough that you don't miss it that much?
For the most part, I don't miss it. I miss it if I'm surfing. The boats definitely do surf, and don't get me wrong, you can surf, but it's just not this. I mean, it's like the difference between surfing an inflatable versus surfing a rigid surfboard. Like no one's going to take an inflatable sup out and like tear up a wave.
But they're not these kind of trips. You're not really encountering a lot of surf spots, I imagine.
Yeah, it's certainly. I mean, we'll find surf waves and we'll sit on them for a minute, but that certainly isn't like the purpose of why we're going out there.
Man, well, that's super cool. Thanks for sharing all of those stories. It's pretty eye-opening to see how your craft can sort of transform how you approach trips. Anything else you want to share before we wrap up?
I guess I'm definitely an advocate of packrafts now, and not just in the sphere. I'm not an evangelical, though. I'm not trying to say that like packrafts are the end all be all and everyone should be in a packraft instead of anything else. One of the cool pieces of packrafts that has really been opened up for us is the ability to fly to trips, where there have been, this last year, I did 5 separate trips where I flew from whatever airport I was near to meet up with the team close to our river. And that is the sort of thing that you're just not doing with a kayak. You're not putting your boat on a plane for a weekend getaway. And we had a trip to California where the 4 of us flew into the Fresno airport. We each checked 1 bag, had our, our boat can fit in our carry-on, and we rented a couple of cars. And then for 5 days, we went and just like hammered out a couple of High Sierra missions, and we were back to work on Tuesday. So
that's awesome.
Like that's an opportunity that starts to present itself. I did the same thing with the box, just for a quick long weekend, flew out to Montana, and Jeff picked me up at the airport and met up. And he and John and I went down to the Clark Fork. But the other real piece of it is that I hope that folks who don't care about pack rafting for themselves just continue to look at people who are in pack rafts as someone who's participating in the same sport. And I think historically there has been a lot of judgment and like othering of being less receptive to the kayaking community is so open. It's in so many cases, barring like really committing class 5 runs, you can show up to the put in and meet up with a group and have someone show you down the river and have folks to paddle with. And I think that a lot of kayakers are less inclined to open their arms so much if somebody shows up in a pack raft. And I think that like you still should ask people questions and vet them a little bit and make sure that the river objective that you're heading out for is appropriate for them. But gosh, if I am picking up some rando at the put-in and letting them tag along in our group, at this point I would kind of rather they be in a pack raft than a kayak, just because if they swim, it's not a big deal. Whereas if there's some like, yeah, exactly. If there's some loose cannon who shows up and is beatering their way down and unprepared in a kayak, they're probably going to have a much worse time than somebody in a pack raft. I mean, I'm still vetting them, but
this is a story that should have been told at the beginning instead of the end, but you just reminded me. I can't resist. This was like, I don't know, I learned it in some safety class from somebody a long time ago when I started kayaking. And there's some guy that was rolling around Colorado for a while who was he was a duckier, but he was a class 5 duckier. Like he'd run some of the shit, and I think the story was at Gore Canyon, where they had been talking to this guy around the campfire at night. And the guy's like, yeah, like I'm just looking for a group to run with tomorrow. And they're like, sure, you can run with us. You seem like a cool guy. And he shows up at the put-in, pumping up his ducky. And then to like cap it off, he has these little kids, like pool floaties, like the kind of things you put around your arm so the kids like float on the water and don't sink. And he like puts them around his wrists and his ankles and like blows them up. And I guess they're like looking at him like, what are you doing, man? And he's like, well, if I swim, I'm like terrified of getting a foot entrapment. These keep my feet up high. And so, to say that duckiers have a bad rap is definitely been a thing, but I think your story,
it's well earned.
Like, you know him. It's well earned. Yeah.
No, I just said like the bad rap that duck ears have is well earned, because there certainly is a long history of people getting in over their heads in duckies, but it's not universal anymore.
Apparently that duck ear guy was actually pretty good, but yeah, I think your stories prove that these are capable crafts. You can't run that level of whitewater if they're not.
Yeah, when I was in, your story just reminds me of a quickie that when I was in Durango, during kind of the Valkyrie prototyping phase, we wanted to go run the Upper Animas, and there was somebody from out of town who had posted on the Durango River Rally Facebook group asking if there was anybody who would show him down the Upper Animas, and I was just like, yeah, well, you can. We're heading out there on Saturday. You can join us. Meet us at Rockwood at 8:30, and so he meets us. We've got shuttle taken care of, and so he meets us there, and we've got a pickup truck. There are 3 of us, and there's one hardshell kayak in the back of the truck, and we throw his hardshell in the back as well, and he just doesn't say anything. He's like, he doesn't know what's going on and what the deal is, but he just like assumes that our other 2 boats are up there or something.
Yeah.
And
you drown them.
But then we get to the put in and start inflating a couple of boats. It's like, oh no. What did I sign up for?
That's hilarious. Man. All right. Well, that's super cool. Thanks for coming on and sharing, Dan. I appreciate it.
Yeah, sure thing. Thanks for the chat, Kevin.